Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift away with me into the shadowed alleys and hidden courtyards of the medieval world, where justice wore many faces, some noble, some cruel, and some too heavy to bear. Our story follows the life of a medieval executioner, a man both feared and needed, both reviled and protected by the very people who cursed his name. Through 22 parts, we shall wander the cobbled streets beside him, peer into the chambers where he waits, and listen to the quiet thrum of his private thoughts as he carries out the king's justice. This is not a tale of violence alone, but of a soul wrapped in chains unseen, of nights spent in candlelight with sins that cling to the skin long after the axe has fallen. Rest easy now, and let us begin. In the waning light of an autumn dusk, a boy named Aldrich sat at the edge of a village square, his small fingers tracing idle shapes into the packed earth. He was scarcely 10 winters old, but already the world had grown harsh around him, his mother taken by the last pestilence, his father a blacksmith with too many debts and too few horses to shoe. The clang of iron rang out from their humble forge each morning, and the same clang lulled Aldrich to sleep each night. But tonight, the clang was not iron. Tonight, the village gathered in tense silence, eyes cast down as a stout man in a leather hood prepared a block of ash wood at the square center. The air smelled of pine tar and straw, a sweetness that did not mask the sour fear. Aldrich crouched behind a broken cartwheel, peering through the spokes. The condemned man knelt beside the block, hands bound tight with rough rope. He was a thief, they said, had stolen bread and cheese from the Lord's kitchen. In times of plenty, perhaps he might have lost only a hand. But this harvest had been thin, and the Lord demanded a lesson be made of him. Aldrich did not know the executioner's name then. Few did. The hood was meant to keep him faceless, an instrument rather than a man. But Aldrich, with the keen eyes of a boy half-starved for understanding, noticed the way the man's shoulders rose and fell with every breath, heavy with a burden no rope could bind. The executioner tested the edge of his axe, a broad, half-moon blade, then placed a steadying hand on the thief's shoulder. The village priest muttered a prayer, words swallowed by the breeze. The thief whispered something back. Aldrich could not hear, but he saw the man's lips tremble. Then the executioner lifted the axe. There was no drumbeat, no trumpet, just the hush of breath held by a dozen frightened peasants and the quick, terrible sound of steel through flesh and bone. When it was done, the villagers turned away, shuffling back to their homes, children led by the hand, mothers clutching baskets tight to their chests. Aldrich did not move. He watched the executioner wipe the blade with a scrap of linen, hands slow and careful. The man removed his hood for just a moment, enough for Aldrich to glimpse dark hair streaked with early gray, a face not cruel but worn, as if life had weathered him down like river stone. Their eyes met, boy and butcher. And in that flicker of time, Aldrich felt something shift inside him. A seed planted deep in soil he did not yet know would grow thorned and tangled. The executioner nodded once, the barest gesture, before covering his face again and walking into the shadows behind the gallows. That night, Aldrich lay awake on a straw pallet beside the forge's dying embers. He replayed the scene over and over, how the man had steadied the thief, how he had finished his grim task without fanfare, how he had looked so terribly alone as the village dispersed. His father, drunk on cheap ale, snored in the corner, oblivious to the thoughts that crowded his son's mind. Outside the small window, a wind stirred the last dry leaves. Somewhere, an owl hooted. Aldrich pressed his palms to his ears, but the hush of steel and the soft thump of a head landing in the sawdust would not leave him. In the darkness, a strange thought came. Someone must do it. Someone must wield the axe. But who chooses such a path? Who bears the weight so others may turn away and pretend it is justice that swings the blade, not flesh and bone? Years passed as they do. Aldrich grew tall, wiry from hauling iron scraps for his father, who drank more with each passing season. The boy's hands toughened, burned by sparks, blistered by hammer handles. But his eyes stayed soft, watchful. He listened when the tavern keepers spoke of new gallows built in the neighboring towns, of lords who demanded ever sterner punishments to keep the hungry in line. He learned which roads the sheriff traveled and which woods the poachers hid in. And always, in the back of his mind, the man in the hood stood silent, an echo of what might come. On nights when the forge fire burned low and his father lay insensible beside the anvil, Aldrich would slip out, feet wrapped in cloth to soften his steps. He crept to the village square, now empty, save for stray dogs and the pale memory of that first execution. He would stand beside the block, long since cleaned, but never truly clean, and place his hands on its splintered edge. He would close his eyes and imagine the weight of the axe, the hush of the crowd, the final breath before the blow. Not once did he feel fear. Instead, he felt the press of something colder. Duty, perhaps, or fate. A knowing that some men swing hammers and some swing blades, and in the end, both carry scars that never fully heal. On a winter's morning, when Aldrich was 17, his father's debts caught up to him. A tax collector, flanked by 2 guards, arrived at the forge. Words were shouted, fists flew, iron tongues raised in anger. When it ended, Aldrich's father lay on the ground, chest still, but eyes wide open to the beams overhead. The debt was settled in blood, but no coin changed hands. The guards dragged the boy away from his father's body and left him kneeling in the snow, breath rising like a ghost. It was the hooded man, older now, back stooped yet still broad, who found him there. No words passed between them. The executioner merely placed a gloved hand on Aldrich's shoulder, just as he had steadied the thief so many years before. And in that quiet, beneath a sky heavy with falling snow, the seed planted long ago cracked open. Aldrich did not flinch when the man asked him to stand. He did not resist when led away from the forge, away from the village that would never again call him son of the blacksmith. He stepped into the unknown, feet crunching through snow that buried all but the harshest truths. Somewhere ahead lay the axe, the block, the hood. And behind him, the forge's dying embers whispered that some fires burn out so others may be kindled. Aldrich's new life began not with blood, but with silence. The hooded man, whose name Aldrich soon learned was Gerard, brought him to a small, squat house at the very edge of the market town, far enough from the main road that the clatter of carts and chatter of merchants faded to a muted hum. The house was half stone, half timber, with a thatched roof so low that Aldrich, still growing into his broad shoulders, had to stoop as he stepped inside. A single room served as hearth, bedchamber, and kitchen. At its center, a narrow fire burned, its thin smoke drifting up to a hole in the ceiling. A battered table stood beside the hearth, its surface scarred by years of careless blades. 2 chairs faced each other, one larger, worn smooth by Gerard's heavy frame, the other clearly meant for Aldrich. Against the far wall leaned a long wooden chest, its iron hinges rusted, its lock heavy and black. Gerard spoke little at first. He showed Aldrich where to stack firewood, how to sweep the ashes, how to fill the battered iron pot with rainwater from the barrel outside. They shared bread dipped in onion broth and salted pork cut so thin it nearly vanished on the tongue. Nights passed in quiet ritual. Gerard sitting by the hearth, oiling the blade of his axe, Aldrich watching the fire's glow dance across the iron. In the mornings, Gerard took him to the training yard behind the house, a patch of packed earth surrounded by a fence of split logs. There, an old stump served as target and teacher both. At first, Aldrich's hands trembled as he hefted the practice axe, its blade blunted, but heavy enough to test his strength. He swung and missed, swung and struck too shallow, swung again until splinters flew and sweat dripped from his brow. "You hold it like a hammer," Gerard grumbled one dawn, his voice low but not unkind. "This is not a blacksmith's tool. It does not shape iron. It parts it." He stepped behind Aldrich, broad hands closing over the boy's calloused fingers. Together, they lifted the axe, felt its weight settle into bone and sinew. Gerard guided his elbows, corrected the arc, murmured small instructions, where to fix his eyes, when to breathe in, when to breathe out. And when Aldrich swung again, the blade sank true, splitting the stump's weathered crown. The days stretched on, each much like the last. Aldrich learned to sharpen blades, to mend leather straps, to oil the wooden hafts until they gleamed darkly in the lamplight. Gerard showed him how to knot ropes tight enough to bind the fiercest man, how to read the signs of a neck too thin for a clean stroke, how to judge the softness of bone beneath skin. These lessons came without flourish or cruelty, practical, grim knowledge passed from one keeper of the axe to the next. Yet for all the harshness, Aldrich found a strange comfort in the work. The practice yard became his world, a place where each blow had purpose, each swing a measure of control over something greater than himself. At night, when he lay on the straw mattress beside the hearth, he listened to the wind rustling through the thatch, to Gerard's slow, rumbling breaths, and to the steady hum of thoughts that now felt less tangled than before. One evening, after a supper of boiled beans and stale rye, Gerard unlocked the wooden chest. The iron hinges squealed in protest, and inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the executioner's hood, the broad axe with its half-moon blade, and a bundle of faded parchments sealed with the mark of the local lord. Gerard lifted the hood first, black leather, stitched by some careful hand long before Aldrich's birth. He turned it in his thick fingers, the firelight catching on its worn seams. "This was my father's," Gerard said, voice barely above a whisper, "and his father's before him, not by blood, by choice, or by lack of one." He set the hood aside, then lifted the axe. Its edge shone even in the dim light, honed to a cruel perfection. This is the weight you will carry when I am gone." Aldrich did not answer. He only watched as Gerard's knuckles whitened around the haft. For the first time, Aldrich saw the tremor in the old man's hands, a quiver that ran from wrist to elbow, a sign that time was stealing strength from the arms that had once brought swift ends to so many. Gerard placed the axe in Aldrich's lap. It was heavier than the practice blades, heavier than any hammer Aldrich had ever swung at the forge. He ran his thumb along the flat of the blade, felt the chill of oiled steel, the faint nicks along the edge where flesh and bone had yielded to iron. "Why me?" Aldrich asked at last, his voice hoarse from the smoke and the weight of the moment. Gerard looked at him, eyes dark and sunken yet bright with an ember of something unspoken. "Because you did not look away," he said simply. "When you were a boy, you did not hide your eyes." They sat like that for a long while, master and apprentice, executioner and heir, two shapes outlined by the flickering hearth. Outside, the wind howled through the fence posts, rattling the loose shutters like bones in a wooden box. Somewhere beyond that dark, the town slept uneasily, never guessing that in this small house at its edge, death's hand was being passed from one to another like a torch in a storm. When sleep finally came, Aldrich dreamed not of blood or screaming crowds, but of the forge. He saw his father's hammer striking hot iron, sparks flying like fireflies. He felt the weight of the old hammer in one hand, the new axe in the other. And in that space between sleep and waking, he understood that both were tools, one to shape the living, the other to unmake them. At dawn, Gerard rose first, as he always did. He found Aldrich sitting by the hearth, the axe across his knees, eyes fixed on the dying embers. Wordlessly, the old man placed a hand on his shoulder, and together they watched the fire gutter and fade. The day would bring new lessons: how to stand before a crowd without trembling, how to bear the stares of mothers, fathers, wives. But for now, in that thin light between night and morning, they were only two men, one weary with memories, the other heavy with a future he could neither embrace nor refuse. And somewhere beyond the frost-laced windows, the world waited for the axe's next whisper, its next final mercy. The first time Aldrich stood before a crowd, the wind carried the chill of early spring, sharp enough to sting the skin, yet not enough to numb the senses. The market square of Brindleham was no larger than the forge yard he once knew, cobbles uneven and slick with old straw, ringed by crooked houses whose upper floors leaned like gossiping old women. A rough wooden platform had been raised beside the well, a plank of weathered oak laid atop sturdy barrels. The block sat at its center, stained dark despite Gerard's careful scrubbing. From his place behind the platform, Aldrich watched the townsfolk gather. Bakers with flour-dusted sleeves, fishwives with aprons stiff from salt, children peeking from behind mothers' skirts. They muttered among themselves, pulling shawls tighter, eyes darting away when they met his. Beside him, Gerard adjusted the fit of his hood. Though the old man's joints ached and his shoulders stooped more each passing day, his voice held firm when he spoke. "Keep your feet apart. Breathe deep through the nose, out through the mouth, and no matter what they shout, what they cry, your hands must not tremble." Aldrich's own hood felt heavy on his head, the leather brushing his cheeks, narrowing his world to a tunnel of flickering daylight and the restless crowd beyond. Beneath the hood, sweat prickled his brow despite the cold. He could hear his own heartbeat, each thud echoing louder than the murmurs drifting up from the square. The condemned man was led forward by two sheriff's men, one burly, the other young and sallow. Their prisoner stumbled between them, feet dragging, breath rasping. He was no hardened villain, but a boy scarcely older than Aldrich himself, with straw-blonde hair plastered to his brow by sweat and tears. His crime, the sheriff had said, was the killing of a merchant during a drunken brawl, a blow struck wild that cracked a skull like an egg. As they reached the block, the boy's knees buckled. One of the sheriff's men cuffed him hard enough to right him. Gerard stepped forward first, his shadow falling long across the prisoner's back. With a calm so practiced it no longer seemed human, the old executioner murmured something. Words lost to Aldrich, but meant only for the trembling ears that heard them. Then, slowly, Gerard turned to Aldrich and nodded once. A silent passing of the moment. A test. Aldrich stepped forward, the broad axe balanced in his grip. The blade felt heavier here than in the practice yard, its polished crescent reflecting the pale, shifting sky. The sheriff read out the sentence, voice dry and officious. By order of the Lord, for murder done under moonlight, the boy was to be beheaded. The crowd hushed as the words drifted into silence. Somewhere a babe cried, quickly muffled against its mother's breast. Aldrich took his place behind the block. His breath came too fast. He forced himself to remember the rhythm. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. His fingers curled tight around the axe's haft, knuckles white beneath the leather gloves. He could see the downy hairs at the nape of the boy's neck, the way his shoulders shuddered with each dry sob. Gerard's voice, low and steady, cut through the roar in Aldrich's head. Mercy lies in the swiftness. Aldrich shifted his feet apart as he had been taught. He raised the axe slowly, feeling every muscle in his shoulders protest the weight. For a heartbeat, he saw not the boy but himself. Kneeling by the forge, snow drifting onto his father's lifeless chest. The world tilted. His arms trembled. A sharp crack, Gerard's staff striking the platform, snapped him back. Aldrich locked his jaw, tightened his grip. He fixed his eyes on the place just above the knot of rope binding the boy's wrists. He felt the hush of the crowd tighten, the way air seemed to hold its breath with him. The first swing must be the last. Always. Anything less was cruelty. He brought the axe down. There was no cry from the boy, only the wet, sudden sound of iron meeting bone, the shudder that traveled up Aldrich's arms and lodged itself behind his ribs. The body slumped forward, head rolling to rest in the sawdust. Somewhere, a woman wailed. Perhaps the mother, perhaps only another villager who saw her own child in the small, broken shape. Gerard moved quickly, covering the boy's head with a rough cloth, wiping the blade with practiced care. He gestured for Aldrich to step back, and together they turned from the crowd. A sheriff's man barked at the onlookers to disperse. Coins clinked into Gerard's gloved palm, payment for service rendered in blood and silence. Back in their small house that night, Aldrich sat by the hearth, his hands scrubbed raw but still smelling of iron and fear. The hood lay at his feet, the axe beside it, blade freshly oiled. Gerard said nothing for a long time, only sat across from him, eyes half closed as if dozing. When he spoke, his voice was little more than a sigh. The first is always the hardest, not for your hands, but for your sleep. Aldrich stared into the fire, the dance of flame painting ghosts on the walls. He thought of the boy's breath, the way it hitched in that final moment, the way the world had seemed to hold him steady and yet so alone. He thought of his own father, debts unpaid in coin but paid in flesh all the same. Outside, the wind scraped at the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and fell silent. Aldrich did not weep. He did not speak. He only listened to the crackle of burning wood, the soft rasp of Gerard's breath, and the faint, unending echo of the axe that now belonged to him as much as to the old man beside him. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it did, it was shallow and filled with shadows. Faces half remembered, voices pleading through the dark. And yet beneath it all, a deeper knowing settled in Aldrich's bones. This path had no turning back, no easy waking. Only forward, only the weight of steel and the hush of the crowd. And somewhere within that hush, perhaps, a chance to find what mercy meant when mercy looked like death. The first time Aldrich stood before a crowd, the wind carried the chill of early spring, sharp enough to sting the skin, yet not enough to numb the senses. The market square of Brindleham was no larger than the forge yard he once knew, cobbles uneven and slick with old straw, ringed by crooked houses whose upper floors leaned like gossiping old women. A rough wooden platform had been raised beside the well, a plank of weathered oak laid atop sturdy barrels. The block sat at its center, stained dark despite Gerard's careful scrubbing. From his place behind the platform, Aldrich watched the townsfolk gather, bakers with flour-dusted sleeves, fishwives with aprons stiff from salt, children peeking from behind mothers' skirts. They muttered among themselves, pulling shawls tighter, eyes darting away when they met his. Beside him, Gerard adjusted the fit of his hood. Though the old man's joints ached and his shoulders stooped more each passing day, his voice held firm when he spoke. Keep your feet apart. Breathe deep through the nose, out through the mouth, and no matter what they shout, what they cry, your hands must not tremble. Aldrich's own hood felt heavy on his head, the leather brushing his cheeks, narrowing his world to a tunnel of flickering daylight and the restless crowd beyond. Beneath the hood, sweat prickled his brow despite the cold. He could hear his own heartbeat, each thud echoing louder than the murmurs drifting up from the square. The condemned man was led forward by two sheriff's men, one burly, the other young and sallow. Their prisoner stumbled between them, feet dragging, breath rasping. He was no hardened villain, but a boy scarcely older than Aldrich himself, with straw-blonde hair plastered to his brow by sweat and tears. His crime, the sheriff had said, was the killing of a merchant during a drunken brawl, a blow struck wild that cracked a skull like an egg. As they reached the block, the boy's knees buckled. One of the sheriff's men cuffed him hard enough to right him. Gerard stepped forward first, his shadow falling long across the prisoner's back. With a calm so practiced it no longer seemed human, the old executioner murmured something. Words lost to Aldrich, but meant only for the trembling ears that heard them. Then, slowly, Gerard turned to Aldrich and nodded once. A silent passing of the moment. A test. Aldrich stepped forward, the broad axe balanced in his grip. The blade felt heavier here than in the practice yard, its polished crescent reflecting the pale, shifting sky. The sheriff read out the sentence, voice dry and officious. By order of the Lord for murder done under moonlight, the boy was to be beheaded. The crowd hushed as the words drifted into silence. Somewhere a babe cried, quickly muffled against its mother's breast. Aldrich took his place behind the block. His breath came too fast. He forced himself to remember the rhythm. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. His fingers curled tight around the axe's haft, knuckles white beneath the leather gloves. He could see the downy hairs at the nape of the boy's neck, the way his shoulders shuddered with each dry sob. Gerard's voice, low and steady, cut through the roar in Aldrich's head. Mercy lies in the swiftness. Aldrich shifted his feet apart, as he had been taught. He raised the axe slowly, feeling every muscle in his shoulders protest the weight. For a heartbeat, he saw not the boy but himself, kneeling by the forge, snow drifting onto his father's lifeless chest. The world tilted. His arms trembled. A sharp crack, Gerard's staff striking the platform, snapped him back. Aldrich locked his jaw, tightened his grip. He fixed his eyes on the place just above the knot of rope binding the boy's wrists. He felt the hush of the crowd tighten, the way air seemed to hold its breath with him. The first swing must be the last. Always. Anything less was cruelty. He brought the axe down. There was no cry from the boy, only the wet, sudden sound of iron meeting bone, the shudder that traveled up Aldrich's arms and lodged itself behind his ribs. The body slumped forward, head rolling to rest in the sawdust. Somewhere, a woman wailed, perhaps the mother, perhaps only another villager who saw her own child in the small, broken shape. Gerard moved quickly, covering the boy's head with a rough cloth, wiping the blade with practiced care. He gestured for Aldrich to step back, and together they turned from the crowd. A sheriff's man barked at the onlookers to disperse. Coins clinked into Gerard's gloved palm, payment for service rendered in blood and silence. Back in their small house that night, Aldrich sat by the hearth, his hands scrubbed raw but still smelling of iron and fear. The hood lay at his feet, the axe beside it, blade freshly oiled. Gerard said nothing for a long time, only sat across from him, eyes half closed as if dozing. When he spoke, his voice was little more than a sigh. The first is always the hardest, not for your hands, but for your sleep. Aldrich stared into the fire, the dance of flame painting ghosts on the walls. He thought of the boy's breath, the way it hitched in that final moment, the way the world had seemed to hold him steady and yet so alone. He thought of his own father, debts unpaid in coin but paid in flesh all the same. Outside, the wind scraped at the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and fell silent. Aldrich did not weep. He did not speak. He only listened to the crackle of burning wood, the soft rasp of Geraud's breath, and the faint, unending echo of the axe that now belonged to him as much as to the old man beside him. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it did, it was shallow and filled with shadows, faces half-remembered, voices pleading through the dark. And yet beneath it all, a deeper knowing settled in Aldrich's bones. This path had no turning back, no easy waking, only forward, only the weight of steel and the hush of the crowd. And somewhere within that hush, perhaps, a chance to find what mercy meant when mercy looked like death. Spring unfurled itself slowly over Brindleham, coaxing green shoots from the black soil and stirring the village from its long winter hush. The thaw brought with it new work for Geraud and Aldrich, petty thieves emboldened by hunger, drunken brawls in the roadside alehouses, disputes over grazing land that turned to blood beneath the budding hedgerows. Each summons came on parchment marked with the Lord's red seal, slipped beneath the door by the sheriff's silent boy at dawn. By now, Aldrich's hands no longer trembled when they lifted the axe. Each time he knelt beside the block, he felt the hush of the crowd coil around him, a living thing that tasted of dread and morbid need. He had learned to keep his eyes on the place just above the rope binding the condemned, to breathe deep, to let the roar of his own heartbeat drown out the cries and curses that sometimes rose before the end. Yet when the blade was cleaned and the crowds dispersed, a different hush lingered, one that pressed at the hollow of his chest long after Geraud scraped the block clean and stored the axe away. It found him in the silence of the hearth, in the restless drift of sleep, where old faces and fresh ghosts mingled like mist. One warm afternoon, as bees hummed over the wild herbs sprouting at the edge of the garden fence, Geraud called Aldrich to sit beneath the crooked apple tree that leaned toward the training yard. The old man's breath rattled faintly in his chest, and his eyes, always deep-set, always shadowed by the hood, looked clearer than they had in many weeks. "You've done well," he said, voice softened by the drone of the bees and the hush of wind through new leaves. "Better than I dared hope. Your hand is sure. Your mind, too, though you wear its burdens clumsy still." Aldrich sat cross-legged in the grass, arms resting across his knees. He said nothing. He had learned that Geraud's words did not always need answers. "There is more to it than the swing of an axe," Geraud went on, eyes half-lidded against the sun. "Any strong arm can split wood. Any butcher can cleave bone. But an executioner—" He paused, a faint wheeze escaping him before he caught it with a slow breath. "An executioner must know when to speak, when to stand silent, when to be seen, and when to vanish like smoke." Aldrich plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between his calloused fingers. "They don't want to see us," he said at last, voice low. "They watch when they must, but they look away the moment the blood hits the straw." Geraud's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Aye. And that is our shield. So long as they look away, we live in the hush between fear and relief. But the day they look too close—" He lifted a trembling hand, tracing a thin scar that ran along his jawline. "The day they remember we are men, not masks, is the day they decide they no longer need us, or they blame us for the blade's hunger." They sat in companionable quiet for a time, the old man drifting into a doze, his head nodding forward before snapping up again. Aldrich watched the clouds drift overhead, soft white herds wandering the endless pasture of the sky. He thought of Myrenne, of her eyes bright with questions she never voiced aloud. He thought of the sweet roll hidden beneath his straw mattress, now gone stale, but kept as if it were a charm against something he could not yet name. Later that week, word came that a traveling noble's guard had found a poacher in the king's forest, snares hidden beneath the bracken, rabbits gutted where they lay. The noble, young and puffed with the weight of his borrowed power, demanded the thief lose a hand at dawn, there in the clearing where the trap was sprung. Geraud spat when he heard it. "Pomp and thunder," he grumbled as he pulled his gloves over knotted knuckles. "The forest is no place for such things. Bad earth for blood to fall on." But at dawn they went, Aldrich following close behind the old man's slow shuffle along the deer path. They found the clearing trampled by soldiers in borrowed finery, their boots muddy with spring thaw. The poacher, a thin man with hollow cheeks and hair matted with leaves, knelt beside a fallen log, his wrists bound tight behind him. The noble, little more than a boy, draped in his father's fox fur mantle, stood nearby, eyes bright with the thrill of command. "You will do it here," he said to Gerard, voice edged with forced authority. "Where he dared to steal, here shall he pay." Gerard bowed stiffly, more from pain than deference. He nodded to Aldrich, who stepped forward, laying down a plank upon the mossy ground, securing the poacher's trembling arm. The forest around them stood silent, branches heavy with dew, birds keeping their counsel among the budding canopy. As Aldrich raised the small hand axe, his eyes flicked to the poacher's face, drawn, hollow, yet calm in a way that unsettled him. The man met his gaze and with a voice barely more than a rasp, whispered, "Do it quick, boy. Don't let the crows get my meat before I'm gone." Aldrich felt a flicker of something dark and sharp. Pity, perhaps, or kinship for a man who took what the woods offered when the world gave him nothing. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and brought the blade down in a clean arc that split skin and bone in a single breath. The poacher did not scream, only hissed between clenched teeth as his blood darkened the moss. The noble, satisfied with the spectacle, tossed a coin at Gerard's feet before turning on his heel, boots squelching in the mud. Soldiers dragged the poacher away, half conscious, his life paid for in rabbits and spring snare wire. They left the clearing as they had found it, save for the smear of red that seeped into the thawing earth. On the path home, Gerard leaned heavy on Aldrich's arm. For the first time, Aldrich felt the full weight of the old man's bones, brittle branches that would not hold the hood much longer. As they crested the rise above Brindleham, the village roofs poking through the trees like squat, patient guards, Aldrich felt the hush settle over him again. In the hush lived the axe, the block, the hood, and the quiet, wondering eyes of a baker's daughter who might one day see the man beneath them all. It was on an evening thick with the first true warmth of spring that Aldrich found himself lingering near the baker's stall long after the loaves had been sold and the shutters drawn. The market square was nearly empty, but for the lowing of cattle penned for dawn's trade and the soft hush of carts settling on their wheels. A thin sliver of moon hung overhead, pale as a bleached bone against the purple dusk. Aldrich stood beneath the crooked sign of the baker's awning, hood pushed back, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn leather coat. His fingers traced the small coin Gerard had pressed into his palm that morning, a single silver penny meant for supper bread, and perhaps, if he dared, something sweeter. Inside, the warmth of the ovens glowed through a crack in the door. He could see Myren moving back and forth behind the counter, brushing flour from her sleeves, stacking wooden boards for the next day's kneading. The sight of her, a figure lit golden by the hearth's gentle light, stirred something in him that felt altogether different from the hush of the block and the hush of the crowd. Here was a hush he could stand inside, without armor, without the leather hood pressing the world to darkness. He rapped his knuckles gently on the doorframe. She started at first, then turned, her face brightening into a small, surprised smile. She pushed the door wider to let him step inside. "You're late for bread," she said, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Or early for tomorrow's." "I thought I'd see if you had a roll left, or two," Aldrich said. His voice sounded strange to him, less certain than when he recited the charges of a condemned man before a watching crowd. Myren tilted her head, studying him as if reading a secret line of script hidden beneath his skin. She moved behind the counter and pulled a small cloth bundle from beneath the boards. "2 sweet rolls. I hid them from my father," she said, lowering her voice as if confiding a dangerous crime. "He says sugar is wasted on lads who only taste salt and iron." Aldrich smiled, a flicker of warmth softening the hard set of his jaw. He fished the penny from his pocket and set it on the counter, but Myren pushed it back with a flour-dusted finger. "Keep it. Sweetness should not be bought with coin alone," she said, wrapping the rolls tight in linen and pressing the bundle into his hands. Her fingers lingered for a breath too long, warm against his rough knuckles. They stood in the hush of the cooling bakery, listening to the faint creak of the oven settling, the sleepy coo of pigeons roosting in the eaves. Outside, the wind carried the smell of tilled earth and the faint tang of distant smoke. Someone burning off last year's dead bramble to make room for new green. Aldrich cleared his throat. Your father? He doesn't mind you speaking with me? She gave a small shrug. He minds many things. He minds the price of flour. He minds the weight of loaves. He minds when the baker's daughter lingers by the market well too long. But he does not see you. Not as I do. At that, Aldrich felt something tighten behind his ribs. Something that wanted to unfold, but did not know how. He shifted the bundle of sweet rolls from one hand to the other, searching for words that did not sound like a sentence passed down from a lord. They fear me, you know, he said at last. The villagers, even your father, even the ones who say good day when they must. Maren's eyes did not flinch. She stepped around the counter, close enough that he could smell the faint sweetness of honey and warm dough clinging to her sleeves. She lifted her hand as if to brush flour from his cheek, but stopped just short. They fear what you do, she said softly. Not who you are. They fear the axe, not the hand that steadies it. Aldrich wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the axe and the hand could not be so easily parted, that each swing carved something out of him, left it buried in the sawdust at the block's base. But the words would not come. Instead, he nodded once, slow and careful, as if any sudden movement might break the hush between them. Maren lowered her hand but did not step back. Next week is the Festival of the Spring Flame, she said, her voice brightening as if she were coaxing him back from darker thoughts. There will be music in the square, dancing, maybe even sweet cider, if my father can spare a jug. Aldrich almost laughed, the sound catching rough in his throat. And what place has the headsman at a festival? She gave him a look that made his heart stutter, a look that said she saw the man beneath the leather hood, the boy beneath the man. Every place is for those who choose to stand inside it, she said. Come, walk the lantern line, dance if you dare, drink sweet cider. For one night, let the axe stay quiet. Aldrich looked down at the rolls in his hand, then back at her. The hush of the block and the hush of the crowd seemed far away in that moment, just shadows at the edge of the bakery's warm light. All right, he said, the promise small but real on his tongue. One night. She smiled then, an unguarded, simple thing that made the air in the small shop feel warmer than any hearth. Outside, the first night crickets began their slow, patient song, a reminder that the world turned always toward new seasons, no matter the blood it left behind. When Aldrich stepped back into the dusk, the rolls tucked safe against his chest, he felt the hush follow him down the lane, not the hush of fear or duty, but the hush of something softer, like a lullaby whispered against the noise of iron and law. And for the first time in many nights, when he lay down beside the hearth's dying embers, he dreamed not of the axe's final mercy, but of warm bread, of lanterns swinging gently in the spring dark, and of a girl's hand reaching for his, unafraid. The days that led to the Spring Flame Festival slipped by like candle wax dripping slow onto a stone floor. Soft, steady, impossible to stop. Brindlehem, usually dull brown and gray beneath the weight of its own caution, began to shimmer with small signs of celebration. Banners of rough-dyed cloth fluttered from windows, their edges ragged but bright as meadow flowers. Lanterns of oiled parchment, painted in childish swirls of green and yellow, swung from beams and doorways. Even the air seemed sweeter, touched with the scent of fresh bread, damp earth, and the faint promise of warmth yet to come. Yet for Aldrich, the hush of the block clung to him still, woven through his waking hours like a hidden thread no festival could snip away. Each morning, he woke to the rasp of Gerard's breathing, the wheeze deeper now, his coughs lasting longer than before. The old man's hands trembled more than ever when he lifted the axe for its daily care, the oiled cloth slipping from his grip until Aldrich took it gently and finished the task in silence. They spoke little of the work that lay ahead. There would always be work. This both men knew. But for now, the Lord's seal did not come. No parchment under the door. No sheriff's boy waiting at the garden fence. In this small pocket of quiet, Aldrich let his mind drift toward the promise Maren had left in his hands like a warm loaf pulled fresh from the oven. One evening, on the cusp of the festival's eve, Aldrich stood at the edge of the square as villagers wound ribbons around the old maypole, a crooked pine trunk dragged in from the woods, stripped of its bark and planted deep beside the well. Children danced around its base, their feet kicking up dust that caught the dusk light like spun gold. The blacksmith's wife, belly round with her fifth child, pinned bunches of early blossoms to the stall fronts. Laughter rose from the tavern doors, sharp and clear like a chisel striking stone. Aldrich watched it all from the shadows beneath the eaves of the tanner's shop. He should have gone home. Gerard would be waiting, expecting his apprentice to check the woodpile, bank the hearth, lay out the iron tools for sharpening. But tonight, the weight of duty pressed less fiercely than the pull of something softer, something that flickered like a lantern glimpsed through fog. "Will you stand there all night?" Came a voice behind him, warm as fresh cider. He turned to find Myren at his shoulder, a basket hooked over her arm, its wicker packed with scraps of bright cloth and thin candles that smelled faintly of honey and tallow. Her eyes danced with the lantern light, reflecting every spark the village dared hang against the dark. "I was only watching," Aldrich said, though the words felt feeble as soon as they left his mouth. "You watch too much," she said, stepping closer until her shoulder brushed his. "Come, help me hang these ribbons. The baker's daughter cannot climb ladders alone, or so my father insists." She led him by the elbow, firm, unbothered by the stares they drew as they crossed the square. He felt the hush follow them like a curious stray, but tonight it seemed thinner somehow, pushed back by laughter and the soft clang of the fiddler tuning his bow. At the old cooper's stall, she set down her basket and pressed a coil of bright green ribbon into Aldrich's rough hand. "Up you go," she said, pointing to the rickety ladder propped against the beam. "Tie it high so the wind will dance with it." Aldrich climbed, boots creaking against the rung, the smell of pitch and old wood filling his nose. He tied the ribbon where she showed him, his thick fingers clumsy with the delicate knot. Below him, Myren steadied the ladder with one hand and shaded her eyes with the other, smiling up at him, as if he were more than the hush that haunted his name. When he stepped down, the last coil of ribbon fluttered behind him like a serpent of spring. Myren laughed, a small sound that made him ache in a place the axe could never reach. They worked until the last candle was lit, until the sky turned a deep blue veloute velvet pinned with early stars. Villagers drifted past them, some nodding in quiet greeting, others pretending not to see the headsman's apprentice tying knots with the baker's girl. But tonight, their glances did not bite so sharply. Tonight, Aldrich felt the hush soften around the edges, worn thin by warmth and cider and the memory of old winters left behind. As the fiddler struck up his tune and the first dancers gathered near the maypole, Myren turned to him, eyes shining with the lantern's borrowed light. "Stay," she said, voice low so only he could hear. "Just for tonight. Let the axe sleep." Aldrich looked past her to the dancing circle, to the children darting in and out of the fire's flicker, to the old men leaning on their canes and clapping time. He thought of Gerard, waiting in the dark house at the village's edge, the hood folded neat beside the hearth. He thought of the poacher's hand left in the moss, of the boy whose neck had broken the hush of his own innocence. And then he looked back at Myren, her hair tangled by the night wind, her eyes open and bright. And for the first time since he first lifted the axe, Aldrich let the hush slip from his shoulders like a cloak. He stepped forward, offering his calloused hand. She took it without hesitation, weaving her fingers through his. The fiddler's bow caught the next note, sharp and clear, and together they stepped into the circle of lamplight and laughter, where the hush could not follow, where for a few stolen hours he was neither butcher nor keeper of the axe, but simply a man, dancing at the edge of spring. The music wound through the square like smoke from a peat fire, thin and curling, but strong enough to cling to every eave and lantern hook. Aldrich felt its pull in his chest more than in his feet, for though he moved awkwardly at first, his boots heavy beside Myren's quick steps, her laughter smoothed his clumsy edges as surely as a whetstone coaxes a blade to true sharpness. They danced at the edge of the maypole's shadow, the ribbons overhead twisting and turning like snakes of bright spring color. The other villagers spun past them in pairs and trios, farmhands in patched coats, the blacksmith's wife with her skirt lifted just enough to skip the mud, the cooper's two daughters with hair braided together as they whirled. No one seemed to mind the headsman's apprentice tonight. If they did, they hid it well behind mugs of warm cider and mouths too busy with song. When the fiddler paused to tighten his bow and sip from a dented flask, my wren tugged Aldrich's hand, leading him toward the edge of the square where the shadows softened the lantern light. She stopped beneath the crooked eaves of the old tanner's shed, the boards behind them silvered by moonlight. "Your boots are dreadful for dancing," she teased, breathless from the spin. Her hand stayed wrapped in his, her thumb tracing the rough edge of his knuckles as if she meant to memorize each scar. "I'll have you barefoot next year?" "Next year?" Aldrich asked, half smiling at the thought. It felt dangerous to speak of nexts and tomorrows when so much of his life lived only in the hush between swing and silence. She caught the shadow in his voice. Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, so near that he could feel the warmth rising off her skin where the night air could not reach. Next year, and the one after that, unless you mean to vanish into the woods and leave me tying ribbons alone." Aldrich let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "I think I'd come back for the sweet rolls." "Good," she said, grinning. "Then I'll bake twice as many, for you, for whoever you are when you're not." She stopped herself, but the word hovered between them like mist. Executioner, headsman, keeper of the hush. He did not flinch at it. Not here, not now, not with the music still echoing soft across the square. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her brow, his fingertips careful against her temple, as if he feared he might mar the softness of her. She leaned into the touch, unafraid of the roughness, the calluses earned in iron and worse. "I wish you could see yourself," she murmured. "Here, not there, not with the block." Aldrich wanted to tell her he didn't know who that was, this man standing barefoot in her dreams, eating sweet rolls that never tasted of iron. He wanted to say that each swing of the axe carved the edges of him sharper and smaller, leaving little room for dancing or the soft hush of her breath so close to his throat. But he only said, "I see you." Her smile faltered then, but only for a heartbeat. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek, so light he felt it more in the way the world seemed to hush around them than in the warmth of the touch itself. From the square, the fiddler struck up another tune, slower now, a drifting melody meant for lovers and old friends who wished to sway more than spin. Marin's hand slid from his and found his chest, resting there above the place where the hush had always made its home. "Dance with me again," she said. And so he did. Not in the bright lantern circle this time, but there, half hidden by the tanner's shed, where only the moon saw them. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. He let his hands find the curve of her waist, so careful, as if she were glass and not warm flesh and spring heartbeat. They swayed there long after the song should have ended, until the fiddler packed away his bow and the children drifted home, wrapped in their mother's shawls. Still they stayed. Aldrich listened to the hush settle around them, different now, softer. A hush filled not with dread but with promise. A quiet kept not by iron, but by the press of her palm against his chest. When at last they parted, the square was nearly empty. Lanterns guttered low, smoke trailing skyward, where the maypole ribbons tangled in the breeze. Marin pressed one final kiss to his rough knuckles, then tucked her basket beneath her arm. "Next year," she said again, and slipped away toward the lane where the baker's windows glowed warm with the promise of rising dough. Aldrich watched her go, her shape growing smaller until only the hush remained, the same hush he would carry home to Gerard's dying embers. He would wake tomorrow and the next day, and the axe would wait beside the block as it always had. But tonight, just tonight, he let himself believe the hush might one day hold more than the promise of endings. It might hold something gentle enough to live for, even for a man with blood on his boots and ghosts in his sleep. He turned for home with the taste of cider and sweet bread still clinging to his tongue, the faint echo of her breath against his neck, a shield against the cold that waited in the shadows beyond the square. The dawn after the festival came shy and pale, as if the sun itself hesitated to climb above the timbered roofs of Brindleham. Aldrich woke to the thin hiss of the hearth's last embers and the dry rasp of Gerard's breath, rougher now, caught in his chest like a splinter that would not come loose. Aldrich moved softly about the house, feeding the fire with careful handfuls of dry sticks, boiling water in the dented kettle, laying out bread that tasted faintly of the sweet rolls Myron had pressed into his hand the night before. Gerard stirred on his cot, his cough rumbling through the small room like distant thunder. "You were out late," the old man said, voice cracked but his eyes sharp, following Aldrich's every move. "Dancing." It was not an accusation, not truly, yet something in Aldrich's chest tightened all the same. He poured water into a chipped mug, added a pinch of dried chamomile leaves they kept for nights when Gerard's breath grew ragged. "For the festival," Aldrich said simply. Gerard's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The festival." He shifted, propping himself on one elbow with a grunt of pain. His hood lay folded on the stool by his side, the axe wrapped neat in oiled cloth beneath it. A king's justice tucked away like a secret between them. He reached for the mug, his hand trembling so badly that Aldrich set it to his lips for him. The old man drank slow, the steam curling around the stubble of his jaw. When he lowered the cup, his eyes found Aldrich's, deep pools darkened by years of watching men go to the block. "I remember," Gerard rasped, his voice softer now, "when my master once danced the same night before a job. He thought the music might wash him clean, even for a while. But when the dawn comes..." He let the thought drift, unfinished, the hush settling in to finish it for him. Aldrich set the cup aside, his own hands resting heavy on his knees. He felt the taste of the cider still on his tongue, the memory of Marin's warmth pressed against his chest like a promise. But in this house, this little wooden box that smelled of oil and iron, promises were thin threads easily frayed by the axe's edge. A soft rap at the door snapped the hush. Aldrich rose to answer it. Outside stood the sheriff's boy, small, sharp-eyed, boots too big for his stick-thin legs. In his hand, he held a folded scrap of parchment, the red wax seal already cracked from careless fingers. The boy said nothing. He never did, only shoved the missive forward before darting back down the lane, his shadow stretching long behind him in the dawn's first shy light. Aldrich turned the parchment over in his palm. He could feel Gerard's eyes on his back, waiting for him to speak what the seal always promised, that the hush of the festival was over and the block must wake again. He broke the wax. Inside, the Lord's crooked script named a name Aldrich did not know, a miller caught in a debt so deep he'd turned cutthroat to pay it, his victim a wool merchant found cold beside the river's bend. The sentence was clear, penned in words as sharp and final as the axe itself. Beheading at midday to be witnessed by the miller's debtors and kin alike. Aldrich folded the parchment, slipping it into his coat pocket with hands that did not tremble. When he turned, Gerard was watching him with that same careful stare, testing, weighing, perhaps hoping for some sign that the boy who once hid behind a cartwheel had not yet turned to iron through and through. "You'll take the lead today," Gerard said, his voice steadier now, as if the work lent him strength even sickness could not drain away. "I'll stand with you, but the swing is yours." Aldrich did not argue. He crossed the room and lifted the hood from the stool, its leather soft and pliant from years of oil and wear. He ran his thumb along its edge, feeling the weight of every name it had hidden, every life it had ended, every hush it had kept. He knelt before Gerard, the old man's eyes level with his now. For a moment they were not master and apprentice, nor keeper and heir. They were two men bound by a task too old and heavy for either to ever truly lay down. "I won't fail you," Aldrich said, though he did not know if he spoke of the swing or of the promise Marin's warmth had left beating in his ribs. Gerard's thin smile flickered and was gone. "No," he said, "you won't." By midday the square would fill again. The hush would gather in every held breath, every lowered gaze, every child's small hand pressed to a mother's skirts. They would watch him lift the axe, and they would turn away when the blow fell. And when it was done, they would look through him again, as if the headsman's mask swallowed the man within. But somewhere in that hush, a memory waited, soft as a spring lantern swinging at the edge of the dark. A promise of next year and the one after, of bare feet and sweet rolls, of a girl who saw more than the axe and the hood. Aldrich pulled the leather down over his brow. He felt the hush close around him like an old, familiar cloak. And then he stood, the axe in hand, the door swinging wide to the bright day that cared nothing for the dreams men clutched beneath their hoods. The day the first snow fell upon the village of Drauheim, a hush seemed to settle over its crooked lanes and timbered houses, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Within the cold stone walls of the executioner's dwelling, Ulrich awoke before dawn, as he often did when the nights grew long and the light scarce. He lay upon his straw pallet, staring at the dark beams above, listening to the muffled stirrings of the world beyond, wind whistling through the shutter slats, the distant bleating of goats in some pen yet to be buried beneath frost. He rose slowly, for the weight of his work pressed upon his limbs like an iron cloak. By the hearth, his daughter Ilsa was already awake, tending to the embers with gentle blows. She looked up at him with eyes so like her mother's, soft gray pools that held secrets and sorrows too old for her tender years. Ulrich grunted a greeting, and she answered with a shy smile, then busied herself with the kettle, coaxing warmth into the morning. The days were quieter now, for the Baron had left for the city weeks past, seeking favor at court while his lands languished under early snows. Without trials, there were no sentences to carry out, no petty thieves to flog, no murderers to hang. Ulrich found the stillness both a blessing and a curse, for while his hands were spared the stain of blood, his purse grew ever lighter. The people avoided him as ever, and so no one came to offer trade or simple kindness. Ilsa's shoes wore thin, and the cupboard grew bare save for a few root vegetables, coarse flour, and a pot of dried lentils. Yet there was peace, too, in this hush of winter. He took solace in small tasks, mending Ilsa's cloak, carving a new handle for his axe, though he prayed he would not need it soon. He wandered the frost-hardened fields at dawn, breathing the sharp air, watching his own breath drift like wraiths among the skeletal trees. Sometimes he would pause by the old chapel at the edge of the village, its stones half buried beneath drifts of snow. There he would stand, listening to the hush of the world, wondering if the saints could ever spare a thought for a man like him. But on this morning, the hush broke when a sharp rap sounded upon his door. Ilsa started, nearly tipping the kettle, and Ulrich frowned. Few dared knock upon an executioner's door, especially before dawn. He crossed the room in 2 strides, lifting the iron latch. Outside stood a boy, no more than 12, wrapped in a tattered cloak, far too big for his bony shoulders. His cheeks were raw with cold, his nose red and running. "Master Ulrich," the boy stammered, voice catching in the cold. "You're to come at once. The steward bids you to the manor." Ulrich's brow furrowed. "The Baron is away." "Aye, sir, but the steward says there's been a killing. A man dead by wicked hands. They found him by the river bend." Behind him, Ilsa hovered, clutching her shawl to her chest, eyes wide and fearful. Ulrich felt a heaviness settle in his gut, a dread that was not unfamiliar, yet always found new ways to burrow deeper. He nodded once, wordless, and gestured for the boy to wait. He gathered his heavy cloak, the fur-lined one he kept for the harshest days, and strapped his boots with stiff leather thongs. He paused before the hearth, pressing a hand to Ilsa's cheek. "Keep the fire," he murmured. "Do not open for any soul, save me." She nodded, but her eyes shone with questions she dared not speak. With that, Ulrich stepped out into the brittle dawn, following the boys' hurried steps through snow that crunched like old bones beneath their feet. The manor sat high upon a low hill, its walls of gray stone crouched beneath drifts of snow that gathered in the eaves and clung to the arrow slits. Smoke rose from its chimneys, thin and blue, vanishing into the pale sky. Servants lingered by the gates, heads bent together, voices hushed as Ulrich approached. They parted for him like reeds before a prow, avoiding his gaze as they tugged at caps or crossed themselves when they thought him blind to it. Inside, the steward awaited in the great hall, a lean man named Berengar, whose thin lips rarely formed more than a sneer. He stood beside the hearth, where a single log spat and crackled, his fine wool cloak gathered at the shoulders. Beside him, 2 guardsmen shifted uneasily, their boots leaving wet marks upon the rushes. "Ulrich," Berengar said, voice clipped. "Come, there is much to be done." He led him through the manor's rear door, out into the courtyard, and beyond the old stables to where the river bend lay half frozen beneath a crust of ice. There, upon the bank, a shape lay sprawled among the reeds, half covered in frost and silt, limbs bent at unnatural angles. A man perhaps no older than Ulrich himself, though time had robbed Ulrich of any illusions of youth. His hair was matted with ice, his throat a ruin of red where some blade or jagged stone had ended him. "Who found him?" Ulrich asked, though he already guessed. "A washerwoman," Berengar replied, sniffing at the cold air. "She came to rinse linens before dawn and saw him floating among the reeds. Dragged him ashore with her brother's help. She weeps in the kitchens now." Ulrich knelt beside the corpse, studying the wound, the frozen fingers curled as though grasping at something just beyond reach. The dead man wore the coarse garb of a miller or cooper, no fine cloak, no sign of wealth to tempt a thief. He turned the man's head gently, peering at the bruise upon his temple, the telltale marks about his wrists. "Tied," Ulrich murmured, "beaten first, then the throat." Berengar shifted behind him. "Aye, and now the folk are frightened. There is talk of a stranger lurking in the woods, or perhaps it is a score to settle. Whatever it is, the Baron will expect it resolved before he returns." Ulrich rose, his knees creaking. The wind cut through his cloak, biting at the scar that traced his jaw, a reminder of a blade turned too soon, too quick, all those years ago. He stared at the river, its sluggish current swirling dark beneath the skin of ice. "I will find who did this," he said at last, though whether it was promise or curse he could not say. Berengar only nodded, already turning back toward the manor. And so Ulrich found himself once more bound to the blade and the rope. Yet this was no sentence delivered from the Baron's lips, but a darker calling, a hunt through frozen lanes and whispered secrets. As he trudged back through the village, the snow fell thicker, soft flakes drifting down to cloak the world in pale silence. But within him, there stirred a storm yet to break, a reckoning that would stain the snow red before the thaw returned. Ulrich returned to his dwelling long after the sun had climbed its pale arc and begun its slow descent behind the frost-bitten hills. Snow clung to his cloak in small clumps that melted upon his shoulders, dripping cold trails down his back as he pushed through the door. Inside, the warmth greeted him like an old friend, though the fire burned low, and Ilse sat curled upon the floor beside it, mending a tear in her sleeve by candlelight. She looked up when he entered, her needle paused mid-stitch. He could see in her eyes the question she did not speak, whether he had done what was needed, whether the grim business that clung to him like a shadow had been fulfilled. He shook his head once, a weary gesture that told her enough. She lowered her gaze and returned to her stitching, though her shoulders sagged with relief or disappointment. Ulrich could not tell which. He shed his cloak by the door, hanging it upon the peg where it dripped steadily onto the rushes. He crossed to the hearth and crouched low, feeding it a handful of kindling, coaxing fresh flames to life. The crackle of dry wood filled the silence between them, and for a moment, the world felt smaller. Just a father and daughter caught in winter's grip, the troubles of blood and death left at the threshold. When the fire burned steady once more, he rose and fetched the coarse bread from the cupboard. Ilse brought the little crock of lentils she had soaked and spiced with what meager herbs she had left. They ate in silence, the warmth of the stew chasing the chill from Ulrich's bones, though it did nothing for the cold that settled deeper, an unease he could not name. At length, when the bowls lay empty and the last embers glowed soft and orange, Ilse spoke. Her voice was soft, as though to wake the ghosts that dwelled beyond the dark corners would be unwise. "Will they find him, father? The one who did this?" Ulrich's spoon paused upon the rim of his bowl. He stared into the dregs of lentils and broth, seeing in them the swirling eddies of the river where the dead man had lain. He thought of the bruises, the bindings, the look frozen upon that slack face, a look that spoke of betrayal more than fear. "I will find him," Ulrich said at last. His voice was not boastful, nor did it carry the weight of righteous certainty. It was simply a truth spoken aloud, a truth that tasted of iron and old guilt. Ilse nodded and rose to tidy the bowls, her small hands working quickly despite the raw red of her knuckles. Ulrich watched her for a moment, then rose to his feet and fetched his knife from the mantel. He ran a whetstone down its edge, the rasping whisper filling the room. It was a ritual he knew well, a quiet communion between steel and stone that reminded him of what he was, what he must always be. When the knife gleamed beneath the flickering candle, he set it aside and pulled his heavy boots back on. Ilsa turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Back to the river," he replied. "Perhaps the dead speak when we listen well enough." Outside, the night was thick with fresh snow, drifting in lazy spirals beneath the wan light of a half-hidden moon. The village lay silent, its thatched roofs crowned with white, the chimneys smoking like dozing sentinels. Ulrich's breath fogged before him as he trudged through the drifts, the crunch of his boots the only sound in that world of hush and hush alone. At the river bend, the water moved slow and sullen, dark veins threading through sheets of ice that creaked softly in the cold. Ulrich crouched at the bank, studying the broken reeds where the body had been found. He traced the footprints left by the washerwoman and her brother, 2 sets of hurried tracks leading back to the village. But beneath them, half swallowed by fresh snow, he found another set, deeper, heavier, pacing the bank before veering away into the woods that pressed close to the river's curve. He followed them, step by careful step, through brittle underbrush and skeletal trees. His lantern cast a pale glow ahead, throwing strange shadows that leapt and shivered among the trunks. Now and then, he paused to listen, to the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant bark of a fox, the murmur of water slipping beneath ice. The tracks led him to a clearing where the snow lay less disturbed, save for a patch near a fallen log where someone had knelt or waited. Ulrich crouched, brushing aside the powdery layer to reveal the signs beneath. A scuffle, the imprint of a boot, the dark stain where blood had seeped into frozen earth. He straightened, eyes narrowing as he turned his gaze back toward the village. Whoever had done this had come here to watch, to wait, perhaps to ensure the river carried the secret away. But the river had failed them, and now the secret lingered like frost upon Ulrich's skin. A soft rustle drew his eye to the tree line beyond the clearing. He froze, breath held tight in his chest. There, just beyond the reach of his lantern's glow, stood a figure, half shrouded by branches, watching him in silence. Ulrich could see no face, only the outline of a hood, the slight rise and fall of breath. He did not speak, neither did the stranger. For a heartbeat, they regarded one another, hunter and hunted, though which was which he could not yet say. Then, as silent as the snow that fell, the figure turned and slipped into the woods, vanishing between the trees as though swallowed by the night itself. Ulrich stood unmoving for a moment longer, his heart drumming steady and cold. Then he lowered the lantern, letting its light dance upon the snow at his feet. He knew then that this was no simple crime of anger or envy. There was something deeper here, a thread that wound through the village like a serpent beneath the drifts. He would follow it, wherever it slithered. For this was his trade as much as the axe and the rope, to walk the dark places where others dared not tread, to lift the stones and see what crawled beneath. When he returned to the village, dawn was a faint promise beyond the trees. And in his mind, the river whispered secrets he could almost hear, secrets that would not rest until they were dragged, struggling, into the cold, unforgiving light. By the time Ulrich reached the edge of the village once more, the pale blush of dawn had begun to creep over the thatched roofs, painting the snow in soft hues of rose and ash. The cold clung to him, seeping through the seams of his cloak, finding the cracks in his resolve. Yet the memory of the figure in the woods burned brighter than the frost, an ember that refused to die. He slipped into his dwelling quietly, careful not to wake Ilsa where she lay curled by the hearth, her small form bundled in old blankets. He paused to watch her for a moment, her brow smoothed in sleep, her lips parted ever so slightly. For a heartbeat, the weight of all he carried felt distant, as if left behind among the trees and drifting snow. But the warmth of that thought faded quickly, chased away by the chill of his purpose. He removed his boots and set them by the door, brushing snow from the worn leather. His cloak he draped over the chair nearest the fire, letting the lingering heat chase the damp from its fur lining. Then, by the faint glow of embers, he fetched a scrap of parchment and a nub of charcoal. He scribbled a note, few words, but enough for Ilsa should she wake and find him gone again. Before first light had truly broken, he was gone once more, lantern in hand, trudging through the village lanes toward the mill at its southern edge. The dead man had been no lord, no scribe or steward. His coarse tunic and thick hands spoke of labor. Barrels, grain, stones turned by river's pull. If truth were to be found, it might linger there, among the turning wheels and sacks of flour. The mill loomed beside the river, its wheel frozen fast where ice clung to the timbers, creaking now and then like old bones complaining beneath winter's weight. Ulrich rapped upon the door with the butt of his lantern, the sound muffled by the frost-laden air. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal a man whose face was half hidden by a rough wool scarf. His eyes flicked from Ulrich's scarred face to the executioner's badge bound to his belt, a sign no man mistook. "Master Ulrich," the miller said, voice tight with unease. "You come early? There is trouble, I hear." Ulrich stepped inside without waiting to be asked. The mill's air was warmer, thick with the scent of grain and the faint, sour trace of damp wood. He turned to the miller, studying him through the shifting shadows. "You knew him," Ulrich said, voice low, more statement than question. The miller hesitated, scratching at the bristle on his chin. "If you mean poor Rorik, aye. He hauled sacks for me these past years. Strong back, fair mind, though his tongue got him in trouble more than once." "Trouble with whom?" The miller shifted, glancing toward the back room where the grindstones loomed like sleeping giants. "He had debts, dice mostly. Cards, when the tavern let him sit. He owed the steward's men silver they claim went missing from the tolls. Berengar turned a blind eye, so long as Rorik worked it off." Ulrich listened without blinking, every word slotting into the dark corners of his mind where questions nested like crows. "Did he fear for his life?" Ulrich asked. The miller snorted softly. "Rorik feared many things. Hunger more than any blade, I think. He'd grumble about shadows now and then, claimed someone watched him when he walked home late. But in this village, who does not feel watched?" Ulrich said nothing to that, for he knew well what it was to be watched, by curious children peeking from shutters, by men who dared not meet his eyes but crossed themselves as he passed. He turned, running a gloved hand along the grain sacks stacked neat against the wall. "Did he speak of the woods?" The miller frowned. "The woods? No more than any man. Wolves prowl there, and worse things, if you listen to old wives' tales. Why?" Ulrich did not answer. He stepped back into the cold light that seeped through the mill's crooked windows. His thoughts tangled and turned like the frozen wheel outside, slow but steady, grinding truth from rumor. When he stepped out into the snow once more, the village had begun to stir. Thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys, the scent of baking bread mingling with the bite of winter air. Women moved about with baskets on hips, their eyes sliding away as he passed. Children, half bundled in cloaks too big for them, played at tossing handfuls of snow before scurrying indoors when they glimpsed his shadow. Ulrich made his way to the tavern next, a squat timbered building crouched beneath a roof thick with snow. Inside, the air was heavy with stale ale and old arguments. A few men hunched over tankards, nursing warmth more than drink. The barkeep, a broad man with a crooked nose and the beginnings of frostbite on his ear, eyed Ulrich warily as he approached the counter. "Master Ulrich," the barkeep muttered. "Drink?" "Information," Ulrich said, voice soft but sharp as the knife at his belt. The barkeep's gaze flicked to the few patrons who pretended not to listen. He leaned closer, breath sour with last night's brew. "What trouble finds you this morning?" "Rorik," Ulrich said, "the man by the river. Who did he quarrel with here?" The barkeep's eyes darted to the darkest corner of the room, where a man sat alone, cloak pulled high about his neck, hood casting his face in shadow. The barkeep said nothing more, but the tilt of his chin was answer enough. Ulrich turned. He did not draw his knife, nor did he raise his voice. He merely crossed the creaking floorboards, his boots leaving wet prints that steamed in the warmth. He stopped before the cloaked figure, who hunched lower still as though to vanish into the splintered bench. "Rorik is dead," Ulrich said, each word as deliberate as a bell toll. "You know why." The man did not answer at first. His hands trembled where they clutched the mug, ale sloshing over the rim. When he finally looked up, Ulrich saw eyes red-rimmed and wild, a fox cornered, all teeth and fear. "I know nothing," the man rasped. Ulrich's shadow fell over him like a curtain drawn tight. "Yet you watched him. The woods bait the river. Why?" Silence settled, thick as the smoke that drifted beneath the low rafters. The man's breath hitched, misting in the cold that clung even here. "They made me," he whispered at last. "Berengar's men. They said, They said he knew something about the tithe, the coin that vanishes every season. I followed. That's all. I never. His words broke like rotted ice, a sob strangled behind cracked lips. Ulrich leaned closer, voice soft as falling snow. Who killed him? The man's eyes darted to the door, to the windows, to the barkeep who studied his mugs as though they might speak salvation. But no help came. He lowered his head, voice a bare shiver. It was not meant to be death. They said frighten him, silence his talk. But he fought. He ran. I did not cut him. By God's mercy, I did not. I only watched. Ulrich straightened. The tavern seemed to grow colder, the hearth's flames paling beneath the weight of secrets spilled. He turned, cloak swirling about his boots, and left the man hunched and shivering in his fear. Outside, snow drifted from the thatched eaves, landing soft upon Ulrich's shoulders. The sun had climbed higher now, though it brought no warmth. He stood in the lane, staring toward the manor that loomed above the village like a crow perched upon stone. Berengar. The steward's name coiled in his thoughts like a snake beneath frost. There, perhaps, the truth waited, curled tight and venomous, daring him to reach into the dark and drag it out into the pale, merciless light. Ulrich did not return home. The cold sun slipped behind drifting clouds, throwing the village once more into a pallid gloom that felt heavier than the gathering snow. He stood a while in the lane outside the tavern, letting the icy wind bite at his cheeks, his breath fogging slow and steady. The truth of it settled upon him like fresh iron. Berengar's hand lay upon this killing. That much was clear. Yet truth was never so simple, never so willing to bare its throat to a man like him. He turned from the village and began the slow ascent toward the manor that crowned the low hill. With each step, the packed snow crunched beneath his boots, a sound too sharp in the hush that wrapped the world. He passed no one on the road. The few villagers abroad kept to their tasks with eyes downcast, burdened by baskets of kindling or heavy buckets of well water. No greetings met him, only the fleeting shadows of glances that slid away as swiftly as they came. The manor gates yawned open at his approach, the old iron hinges shrieking softly in the wind. 2 guards loitered within the courtyard, their spears at rest, their faces hidden behind rough wool hoods. They stiffened as Ulrich strode past, but none moved to halt him. He was not a man to be denied passage, not when the badge at his belt spoke of rope and blade and the Baron's will, though the Baron's voice was distant now, an echo that faded beneath the hush of falling snow. Inside, the steward's hall glowed with the warmth of a crackling hearth. Berengar sat at a high table near the flames, bent low over a ledger, quills scratching across parchment in small, precise strokes. He did not look up at once, though Ulrich's shadow fell long across the rushes strewn upon the floor. When at last he lifted his eyes, they were sharp and narrow, like a fox disturbed at its burrow. Master Ulrich, Berengar said, his voice dry as old parchment. You bring word? Ulrich stepped closer, each footfall deliberate, his boots leaving melted tracks upon the stone flags. He did not sit, though a chair waited beside the hearth. He remained standing, looming as the flames flickered behind him. I bring questions, he said. His voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath. Berengar's quill paused mid-word. He set it aside with a delicate care, folding his hands upon the open ledger as though to hide the ink stains upon his fingers. Then ask, he said lightly, and may God grant I hold answers worth your time. Ulrich studied him in the shifting glow. Berengar's thin lips, his pale brow, the faint sheen of sweat that gathered at his temple despite the chill. He smelled faintly of ink and stale wine, the scent of a man long buried in his own secrets. Rorik, Ulrich said. He owed coin, you told me, coin that vanished from the tolls. Aye, Berengar replied, voice quick and smooth, a common enough sin in these parts. Men grow greedy when bellies empty faster than purses fill. He spoke of it, Ulrich said, spoke to the wrong ears, and now he lies cold by the river. The steward's hands flexed upon the ledger. His eyes flickered to the guards who lingered at the far end of the hall, their spear tips glinting in the firelight. I did not kill him, Berengar said, if that is what you mean to suggest. You ordered it, Ulrich countered, his tone a soft toll, like the iron of the church bell that rang for the dead. Berengar's laugh was thin, strained, echoing oddly in the high rafters. Ordered? You think I waste breath on a miller's drivel? I have duties enough without tending to the gossip of drunkards. Ulrich stepped closer still, and the flames cast his shadow tall upon the paneled wall. He could smell the fear now, faint but rising, bitter as curdled milk. "A man watched him," Ulrich said. "Paid by your men to follow. He spoke of fright, not murder. But Rorik ran. He fought. He bled." The steward's composure cracked, just for a moment. His eyes darted again to the guards, then back to Ulrich, voice lowering to a conspirator's hush. "You think you know so much," Berengar hissed. "But you know nothing of the coin that disappears each season. Nothing of the hands that reach from the city to fill their coffers. I do what must be done to keep this village from ruin. To keep the Baron's favor." Ulrich did not flinch. He had seen men speak these words before. Justifications wrapped in fine cloth, pretty lies embroidered upon old truth. He knew the taste of them. He leaned closer until he could see the flecks of fear swimming behind Berengar's eyes. "You will name the others," Ulrich said. "Those who share your secrets, or I will drag you to the square and let the people see the rot you hide behind your ledger." Berengar's mouth twisted, half snarl, half plea. "You think they will thank you? They will spit upon you, Ulrich, as they always have. They need their bread more than your truths. They will not stand with you." Ulrich said nothing. He turned from the steward, his cloak brushing the rushes as he moved to the great doors. At his back, Berengar's voice rose, thin and desperate. "You do this, and you bring ruin. You think the Baron will protect you? He will be rid of you the moment your axe grows too heavy with truth." Ulrich paused at the threshold, his hand upon the iron latch. He glanced back once, his eyes cold as the drifting snow. Then let him try. He stepped out into the courtyard where the wind caught at his cloak, tugging it about his shoulders like the wings of some dark bird. The guards watched him go, but did not follow. The hush of the village lay waiting below, the snow falling thicker now, blanketing the footprints of the guilty and the innocent alike. Ulrich made his way down the hill as the first bells of dusk tolled from the chapel tower, soft, mournful notes that drifted through the hush like echoes of a reckoning yet to come. And in his mind, he saw the rope coiled by his hearth, the axe edge gleaming in the firelight. Winter would not last forever. When it broke, so too would the secrets buried beneath the snow. And Ulrich, the executioner, would stand ready to swing the blade that severed lies from truth. No matter whose neck bent beneath its weight, Ulrich's boots traced a slow path back through the village, each step heavy with the echo of what must come. The hush of dusk pressed close now, as if the world itself feared to breathe too loud, lest it wake the cold truth coiled beneath the snow. Lanterns flickered to life behind shuttered windows, their faint glow like distant stars scattered across the timbered lanes. Yet none dared open a door to him, nor did he seek warmth or word from any tongue but his own. When at last he reached his dwelling, he paused a moment at the threshold. The door stood just as he had left it, bolted tight against the drift and dark. He laid a hand upon the wood, feeling the faint warmth seeping through where the hearth still burned within. A breath left him, drifting in a pale plume that faded into the gathering dark. Inside, Ilsa sat upon the floor by the fire, needle in hand, though the garment in her lap lay forgotten. She looked up as he entered, her gray eyes catching the flicker of flame and reflecting it back at him. Small lanterns of her own, brave against the gloom. "You did not sleep," Ulrich said, voice a low murmur as he shed his cloak and boots. "I waited," she replied, her words small but steady. He crossed to her, lowering himself beside the hearth where warmth licked at his stiff fingers. For a moment he simply sat, listening to the soft hiss and crackle of the wood as it burned away into ember and ash. The quiet pressed in around them, broken only by the wind's sigh against the shutters. Ilsa reached out, her small hand finding his. Her fingers were cold, roughened by needlework and winter's bite, yet to him they were softer than any velvet a lord might drape upon his throne. "Will they come for you?" she asked, her voice so quiet he felt it more than heard it. He looked at her then, really looked. The child his wife had left him. The child who learned too young that her father's shadow fell longer than most. The child who, despite all the whispered curses and fearful glances, still placed her trust in hands that had ended so many lives. "They may," he said, and the truth of it settled like an anvil between them. "But not tonight." Ilsa held his hand tighter, as if she might anchor him here, by this small hearth, safe from the storms he carried behind his ribs. He squeezed back, and though no warmth could banish the chill in his bones, the simple touch steadied something deep within him. When at last she drifted to sleep beside the fire, her breath soft and even, Ulrich rose. He draped a blanket over her shoulders and stood a moment longer, watching the firelight dance across her pale brow. Then he turned to the work yet waiting in the hush beyond the door. He fetched his axe from its place above the hearth, running a thumb along its edge. Still keen, though the years had dulled its gleam. He would need it sharp, sharper than the lies that clung to the steward's ledger, sharper than the fear that bound good folk to silence. Beside the axe lay a coil of rope, rough hemp that smelled faintly of tar and old rain. He gathered it too, winding it round his arm until it rested heavy against his shoulder. His boots he pulled on once more, leather stiff with cold but still loyal. Before he stepped out, he paused by the table and dipped his quill in the ink pot. Upon a scrap of parchment, he left a line for Ilsa, no promise of return, only a truth she would know in her bones even if he never spoke it aloud. All I do so you may sleep unafraid. Outside, the wind stirred drifts against the door, whispering secrets through the thatch. He moved down the lane like a ghost wrapped in furs and steel. Each window he passed flickered with warmth he would not taste tonight. He did not resent it. Such warmth was not his to hold. His was the cold task, the dark work that let others sleep beneath their blankets without fear of blades in the dark. The chapel bell tolled the last of the dusk hour as he passed beneath its shadow. He paused there, hand resting upon the rough stone, eyes lifted to the pale shape of the steeple that vanished into swirling flakes. Somewhere within, the old priest tended his candles and mumbled prayers for a flock that never quite believed him. Ulrich wondered if those prayers ever reached ears willing to hear the likes of him. He doubted it. Yet tonight he left no offering, no whispered plea. He had learned long ago that some burdens must be carried by mortal hands alone. He moved on through the village's edge and into the fields that lay beyond, white and still beneath the moon's hidden gaze. There, near the hollow, where the river bent sharp, the woods waited, black limbs scratching at the sky, roots sunk deep into secrets and bones alike. He found his mark where he had left it, the clearing where Rorik's blood had frozen into the earth. Around it, the snow drifted higher now, softening the harsh memory of death into something almost peaceful. Yet beneath that hush, the truth still festered. He worked quickly, driving a stake into the frozen ground. The rope he unwound, testing its strength against the pull of his own weight. The axe he laid upon a stump nearby, its edge catching what little moonlight slipped between the trees. He was not fool enough to think his snare would drag the steward into the woods like some beast in the night. But the figure who watched from the shadows, the one whose shape had flickered like a ghost among the branches, that one would come again. He could feel it in his bones, a truth cold and certain as the snow beneath his boots. So he crouched low, cloak drawn tight, breath quiet among the sighing pines. He waited, patient as winter itself. For Ulrich was a man who knew that sometimes the blade's true work was not in the swing, but in the silence that came before, the hush in which all secrets feared to breathe, lest they be heard by the executioner who carried the night upon his shoulders. The hush of the clearing wrapped around Ulrich like an old familiar shroud, cold and close, yet oddly comforting in its simplicity. He crouched behind the stump where his axe rested, breath shallow, eyes trained upon the thin trail that snaked through the pines toward the village's edge. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals, settling upon his shoulders, his hood, the rough coils of rope that lay at his feet. Time slipped by in slow, silent currents. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch cracked beneath the weight of snow, echoing like a muffled drum. An owl called once, its voice low and mournful, then fell silent again. Ulrich's knees ached against the frozen ground, yet he did not shift. The cold gnawed at his fingers through the thin leather of his gloves, but he welcomed the pain. It kept his mind sharp, tethered to the moment, warding off the ghosts that sometimes slipped through the cracks of waiting silence. He thought of Ilsa, curled by the hearth, the blanket drawn up to her chin. He wondered if she dreamed of warmth and soft days, of a life untouched by the iron tang of blood and secrets. He wondered if she dreamed of her mother, a face Ulrich himself could scarcely summon now without effort, features worn smooth by time and regret. He hoped so. Better that than to dream of the things that haunted him. At last, a flicker of movement broke the stillness. Ulrich's eyes narrowed, following the shifting shape that slid between the trees. No deer or fox this time, but something that moved with the caution of a man who knows the forest too well to trust it. The figure paused near the edge of the clearing, just where the moonlight slipped through the branches and caught the faint sheen of a hood drawn low over the brow. Ulrich did not move. He did not even breathe deep enough to stir the snow upon his cloak. Instead, he waited, watching as the figure's head turned this way and that, seeking signs of disturbance. The hush worked in Ulrich's favor. The snow had softened his tracks. The drift concealed the small stake driven into the earth. The rope coiled in such a way that even a hunter's sharp eye would slip past it in the dark. Slowly, the figure crept closer, boots crunching softly through the crusted snow. Ulrich could hear the faint hitch of breath, the creak of worn leather. He noted the way the man favored his left leg, an old wound, perhaps, or simply the ache of winter-biting bone. Closer now, close enough that Ulrich could see the raw edge of the man's cloak where it had been hastily mended, the dull glint of a blade strapped to his belt. A footfall brushed the rope. A snap, a hiss of tension loosed. In a blink, the snare caught, the loop yanked tight around the figure's ankle, hauling him sideways into the drift with a muffled grunt. Ulrich rose in one fluid motion, axe in hand, boots crunching over the clearing, as the man thrashed and cursed, clawing at the rope that bit into his leg. Ulrich's shadow fell over him before he could draw his knife. One heavy boot pressed upon his chest, pinning him to the snow, the blade of the axe hovering near enough to catch the trembling reflection of wide, fearful eyes. "Speak," Ulrich said, his voice a low growl that seemed to stir the hush itself. "Or bleed here, where the snow will bury your lies." The man's breath came in ragged plumes. He tried to twist free, but the rope held fast, the stake driven deep into frozen earth. He stilled at last, chest heaving beneath Ulrich's boot. "I'm no killer, I swear it." Ulrich pressed the axe edge closer, letting its cold bite kiss the hollow of the man's throat. "Then why the woods? Why the river? Why follow a miller to his grave?" The man's lips trembled, his teeth chattering more from fear than cold. "Orders. That's all it was. Orders from the steward's men. Watch the miller, keep him from wagging his tongue. He spoke of silver missing, silver that never reached the baron's coffers." Ulrich's eyes narrowed, the scar along his jaw tugging tight as he listened. "And when he spoke too much?" The man's gaze darted to the shadows beyond the clearing, as though expecting help to emerge from the hush. None came, only the whisper of wind through the black branches. "It was never to be death," he rasped. "Berengar, he wanted fear, not a corpse. But Rorik, he fought, ran. They chased him to the bend. There was a struggle. I swear by all saints, it was not my hand that opened his throat." Ulrich studied the man's face, searching for the tremor that betrayed a lie. Yet fear made truth and falsehood twin brothers, and he knew better than to trust trembling lips alone. "Who held the blade?" he asked. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the axe's edge. "Otto. Otto of the steward's guard. He said it was clean work, quick, quiet. But there was blood, more than any of us wanted. They dragged him to the river, hoping the current would do the rest." Ulrich's foot lifted slightly, the weight shifting from the man's ribs, but the axe did not move. "Where is Otto now?" The man's eyes darted again, this time toward the village lights that flickered faint through the trees. "At the manor. Or the tavern, if the ale's good enough. He boasts when drunk, boasts of coin and secrets that buy him warm fires and fatter cuts than the rest of us." A low growl built in Ulrich's throat, a sound more beast than man. He stepped back at last, freeing the man from the snare with a sharp yank that left the rope coiled and ready for its next task. "Go," he said, his voice a hush deeper than the snow's own song. "Tell no soul you saw me here. If you do, I will find you, and the snow will cover what remains." The man scrambled to his feet, clutching at the welt upon his ankle, eyes wide as he backed away. He vanished into the trees like a startled hare, leaving only broken drifts and frantic tracks behind. Ulrich watched until the last rustle faded, then bent to gather the rope and stake, brushing snow from the axe's cold edge. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the steady, gnawing certainty that the blade's work was not yet done. When he turned back toward the village, the moon broke free of its shroud, casting pale light upon the path ahead. In that cold glow, Ulrich moved without hurry, boots whispering through the snow. Otto would be waiting, whether by fire or by ale, but the rope would wait with him, and the hush would keep their secrets until dawn's first bell tolled once more. The village lay hushed beneath a shroud of moonlight as Ulrich made his way back along the narrow track from the woods. The snow, fresh and soft, swallowed his steps behind him, so that if any soul peered from shutter or loft, they would see only a tall, cloaked shadow drifting silent beneath the winter sky. The coil of rope hung heavy at his side, the axe he'd sheathed at his belt, its cold weight a familiar promise against his hip. He passed no one on the lanes, save for a thin cat that slinked from beneath a woodpile, its yellow eyes catching the moon's pale gleam before it vanished again into the dark. Ahead, the tavern squatted low and sullen beneath a heavy drift that sagged the thatch like a weary shoulder. Faint laughter and the clink of mugs leaked through the warped shutters, thin warmth leaking into the hush that pressed close all around. Ulrich paused beneath the tavern's crooked sign, feeling the hush thrum in his chest like a second heartbeat. He knew this place well, knew its stale reek of spilled ale, its sour heat, the way its corners gathered secrets like dry leaves gathering beneath old stones. Within its walls, a man might drown his guilt or brag of it if the ale burned hot enough in his belly. Tonight, one such man waited for him, Otto of the Steward's Guard, careless enough to drink with his mouth half open while the cold world beyond sharpened its blade. Ulrich pushed through the low door, ducking his head to clear the lintel. Warm air, thick with the stink of sweat and cheap beer, wrapped around him at once. Heads turned and quickly turned away again. Men hunched deeper into their cups. Women slipped past without meeting his eyes. Even the barkeep, broad and scarred, stiffened at the sight of the executioner's badge gleaming dull beneath Ulrich's cloak. He scanned the cramped room. By the hearth, where the biggest log hissed and popped, sat Otto, broad shoulders hunched forward, ruddy face split by a grin too wide for its own good. A ring of men leaned in close, drawn by his low, bragging voice. One laughed too loud at some foul jest, and Otto threw his head back, guffawing so hard the tankard in his hand sloshed dark ale over the rushes. Ulrich stepped forward. Each tread upon the planked floor was like the strike of a hammer upon an anvil, and though the murmur of voices dipped and rose again, no one mistook the hush that followed in his wake. He stopped at Otto's shoulder. The guard's laughter broke like rotten ice. He twisted about, mug still in hand, eyes going wide as they found Ulrich's shadow looming over him. "Master Ulrich," Otto slurred, trying for a smile that slipped off his face like butter on a hot stone. "Come for a drink? Sit. We've coin enough for—" Ulrich reached down and closed a hand around Otto's collar, hauling him up so sudden the man's feet scraped the floorboards. The others shrank back, tankards forgotten, eyes darting to the door and the corners, as if hoping the shadows might swallow them whole. The barkeep opened his mouth, thought better of it, and busied himself wiping clean mugs that did not need wiping. Ulrich said nothing. He turned, dragging Otto with him through the thick heat and stale stink, out into the bite of night once more. The door slammed behind them with a sound like the snap of a distant gallows rope. Otto stumbled in the snow, breath misting in ragged gasps. The ale on his tongue fled him quick enough when he felt the cold bite of the axe's haft pressed firm against his back. "Ulrich, Master Ulrich," he began, but the words tangled behind his teeth as Ulrich forced him down the lane, away from the tavern's faint glow and back toward the hollow that waited like a dark mouth at the village's edge. The wind keened low through the timbered cottages. A dog barked once from behind a gate, then fell silent when it caught Ulrich's scent. No door opened. No window stirred. The hush gathered close again, heavy as a burial shroud. At the hollow's edge, Ulrich pushed Otto to his knees. The man's hands came up in clumsy protest, palms turned out as if they might ward off the cold or the blade. Perhaps both. "Mercy, Ulrich," Otto panted, Al's sour breath mingling with the steam of his fear. "I done as I was bid. Berengar's word, not mine. He said scare him only, you must believe it." Ulrich knelt, bringing his scarred face close, his eyes two cold stones beneath the rim of his hood. Rorik is dead. Otto's mouth worked, jaw quivering as he searched for some shape of plea that might save him. A shove, that's all. He fought. He slipped. The ice. God's truth. The ice took him. Ulrich's silence weighed more than any oath. He reached for the rope, unwinding its length, slow and deliberate. Otto's eyes followed every loop as if watching a serpent uncoil to strike. Berengar ordered this? Ulrich asked. Otto's nod was desperate, jerking like a puppet on a frayed string. Him and others, not just me. There's coin from the tolls, coin from the woods, hidden by the steward's scribes. I'm no master of it, I swear. Ulrich bound Otto's hands before the man could speak more. The knot pulled tight beneath his raw wrists. The wind howled through the hollow, lifting the edge of Ulrich's cloak, brushing snow against his cheek like a cold hand. You will come with me, Ulrich said, his voice so soft that Otto shuddered to hear it. You will speak these words again before the Baron's hall. Otto's eyes bulged. Berengar will kill me before the sun's up. He'll have me silenced as he did Rorik. Ulrich drew the axe and let its edge rest on Otto's shoulder, cold metal against thin wool. Then stay silent now, and lose your tongue with your life. Or stand with me in the dawn. Otto's breath hitched, his shoulders sagging as the hush pressed closer, the snow swirling in soft, accusing spirals about his knees. Ulrich rose, hauling the man to his feet by the rope that bound him. Together, they turned back toward the village lights that trembled faint in the darkness. Above them, the clouds parted just enough to spill a thin wash of moonlight over the path ahead, pale and narrow as a blade's edge, waiting to cut the truth free from the lie. And behind them, the hush closed tight again, gathering the cold and the shadows for what must come when morning found them both. The road back to the heart of the village felt longer than any Ulrich had walked in years, though it could not have been more than half a mile from hollow to hall. Otto stumbled often, the rope at his wrists tugging him forward each time he hesitated, his boots slipping over crusted drifts that hissed underfoot. Behind them, the night seemed to lean in closer, as if the hush itself wished to hear each labored breath and muttered curse. Ulrich said nothing as they went. He needed no words now. His silence was command enough. Around them, the village lay drowned in sleep. Only the steady whisper of snow drifting off eaves broke the quiet, that and the faint rasp of the prisoner's boots scraping over frozen earth. When they reached the crooked lanes near the chapel, Otto's fear began to bleed through the ale still sour on his breath. He twisted at the rope, flinching at shadows that were nothing more than the sway of bare branches. He hissed broken pleas over his shoulder. Ulrich, Ulrich, listen to me. Berengar will not wait. You show me to the Baron's men, and he'll put blade to my throat before the sun touches the manor stones. Ulrich did not break stride. He kept his hand firm on the rope, dragging Otto's protests behind him like a tin clattering over cobbles. He will not touch you before I am done, Ulrich said, his voice low and flat as the iron at his belt. They passed the old well at the lane's bend. Its stones rhymed with frost, so thick it glittered like scattered salt in the pale lanterns that flickered weakly from shutter cracks. Somewhere behind those shuttered windows, villagers lay awake. Ulrich knew it well enough. They listened for his tread and prayed it would pass them by. And tonight, for once, their prayers would hold. At the rise where the lane turned toward the manor's lower gate, Otto stumbled once more, pitching to his knees with a gasp that turned to a broken sob. Ulrich stood over him, snow hissing about his boots. For a heartbeat, the hush pressed in so tight that even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for Ulrich's next breath. Up, he commanded. Otto's shoulders heaved as he gathered himself, head bowed low, rope cutting fresh red lines into his chapped wrists. His voice came out a cracked thing, part fear, part plea. Ulrich, I beg you, mercy my wife, my boy. Ulrich felt the words like cold rain sliding off old scars. He bent, hauled Otto to his feet, his grip iron upon the rope. My mercy, he said, his eyes hard as the frost that clung to the chapel stones nearby, is that your neck finds a rope by daylight, not a knife in the dark. Otto fell silent at that, his breath catching in his throat as they crossed beneath the old chapel's shadow. The bell above, mute and rhymed with snow, seemed to watch them pass. Ulrich thought of the countless prayers whispered beneath that timbered roof, prayers for warmth, for bread, for forgiveness. He wondered if there had ever been one uttered for the likes of him. an executioner with no altar but the block, no gospel but the steady swing of the blade. At the manor's lower gate, 2 guards stepped from the post, spears glinting in the half-moon's pale gaze. They saw Ulrich, saw the rope in his grip, and stepped aside without word or protest. His badge spoke louder than any command. They averted their eyes as Otto was dragged past, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Through the gate, the manor rose dark and sullen above the courtyard, its stones slick with frost, its windows leaking thin trails of candlelight, like eyes half-lidded against the night's bite. The main doors groaned at Ulrich's shove, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. Within, the warmth wrapped round him at once, sharp and sour with smoke and the scent of old rushes. Berengar was there, just as Ulrich knew he would be. The steward sat before the hearth, ledger open upon his knee, quill scratching despite the hour. He looked up, eyes sharp as a stoat's, lips twitching at the sight of Otto bound and shivering at Ulrich's side. "Ulrich," Berengar said, voice like silk drawn across a blade, "you come late, and you bring filth with you." Otto flinched at the word, shoulders curling inward, as if he could vanish into his own cloak. Ulrich stepped forward, hauling the man to stand upright, rope stretched tight between them, like the last line of truth yet uncut. "He will speak," Ulrich said, his voice carrying into every corner of the hall, where servants and guards lingered in doorways, drawn by the hush that seemed to cling to him like a cloak. Berengar rose, the ledger snapping shut in his thin fingers. His smile did not reach his eyes. And what tale does he tell, I wonder? A drunkard's slur? A gutter's mutter to save his own neck? Otto's voice burst forth, ragged and desperate. "I speak truth. Rorik's blood is on his hands, Berengar's orders, coins stolen from the tolls, hidden in false ledgers." A hiss of breath cut him short. The steward stepped closer, the hearth's light dancing over the thin sheen of sweat upon his brow. "Ulrich," Berengar said softly, too softly, "you drag a rat in here, hoping his squeals will serve you? And if he squeals of you next, how many necks have you taken for coin enough to warm your hearth, Ulrich did not move. He let Otto's words hang there, the hush gathering them up, weighing them against the steady hammer of his heart. Slowly, he turned his scarred face to the guards at the hall's edge, the servants frozen halfway through tasks they would not finish tonight. "Bring the Baron's seal," Ulrich said, voice calm as falling snow. "Wake what men you must. Before dawn, the Lord will hear these words from my tongue and his." Berengar's smile cracked, lines deepening like old wounds reopened. "You think you can drag me down with some gutter thief's moan? You think you stand above the rope you wield?" Ulrich's hand tightened on the axe at his belt, the hush deepening until the heart's crackle was the only sound between them. "I stand beneath it," he said, each word measured as a tolling bell, "and I fear it less than the silence you thought would bury the dead." Otto sagged at the end of the rope, trembling with something that might have been relief if fear hadn't hollowed him out so completely. Beyond the manor walls, the wind rose to a low moan, as if the night itself gathered breath for what the dawn would demand. And in that hush, Ulrich felt the blade waiting, patient, sharp, and cold as the snow drifting softly past the manor's ancient stones. Dawn broke slowly over Drauheim, gray and wan, as though the sun itself were reluctant to cast its light upon what secrets the night had unearthed. Within the manor's great hall, the hush that had settled when Ulrich dragged Otto through its doors lingered still, a thick, watchful quiet that clung to the old beams and stone floors like a frost that would not melt. Ulrich stood near the hearth where the embers burned low. Otto slumped on a bench beside him, wrists bound tight with the rope Ulrich had carried through the woods. Otto's eyes darted between the guards posted at the door, men who shifted uneasily beneath the weight of this hour, glancing now and again at Ulrich as if to measure the steel of his resolve. Across the hall, Berengar paced, his fine cloak drawn tight about his shoulders, quill and ledger abandoned on the high table. His thin lips moved in silent calculation, eyes flicking to the shuttered windows, where the first weak light pressed against the frost-rimmed panes. It would not be long before the Baron returned. Word had been sent on swift horses before dawn's first bell, carried by a stable lad whose breath had risen in frantic clouds as he galloped down the rutted lanes toward the Baron's winter lodge in the hills. Ulrich knew the boy would ride like the devil himself snapped at his heels, Coin and fear are swift spurs when paired together. In the hush, Otto began to mutter, soft and low, words half prayer, half plea. Ulrich ignored him, eyes fixed on Berengar, as the steward stalked the length of the hall like a caged wolf, pausing now and again to whisper sharp commands to the guards nearest the doors. He saw the fear behind the steward's thin composure, the way his fingers twitched as if they ached for the comfort of a quill or a hidden blade. At length, Berengar turned, voice sharp enough to snap the hush like brittle ice. "You overreach, Ulrich. This is no work for an axeman. You serve the Baron's justice, nothing more." Ulrich's voice came slow and heavy, like stones rolling down a grave mound. "I serve the truth when the law grows blind." Berengar's lips curled into something like a sneer. "And who judges you, butcher? Who binds your hands when your blade grows thirsty?" Ulrich let the words pass over him like wind through winter branches. He knew the shape of them too well: accusation, disdain, the whispered poison of men who wrapped themselves in ledgers and seals to mask the same rot he bled out with rope and iron. He only stepped closer, his shadow long in the fire's guttering glow. "You fear the rope now," Ulrich said, voice low enough that only Berengar and Otto heard. "Because you know it holds your name, same as any thief or murderer who kneels at my block." Berengar's sneer faltered. He opened his mouth, perhaps to bark for the guards to seize Ulrich there and then, but a shout at the far end of the hall cut him short. The great doors groaned open on iron hinges. Cold air swept in, biting through the rushes strewn across the floor. And there, stepping into the hush with his cloak billowing behind him, came the Baron of Drauheim. He was a lean man, not tall but straight-backed, his dark hair streaked at the temples with winter's white. His boots were muddied from the road, his gloves damp with melted snow. Yet his eyes, sharp and clear beneath the weight of travel, missed nothing as they swept over the hall. Ulrich with his rope and axe, Otto trembling on the bench, Berengar frozen mid-stride like a fox caught in the trap's steel jaws. Behind the Baron, 2 men-at-arms closed the doors and took their posts at either side, spears upright, eyes fixed ahead. The hush thickened, settling like snow upon old graves. "Ulrich," the Baron said, his voice steady, the first word striking the silence like the first bell of morning mass. "You call me from my lodge at dawn. I trust the truth waiting here is worth the ride." Ulrich bowed his head once, low and respectful, though not humble. Never humble, for the axe has its own dignity no lord can strip away. When he lifted his gaze, it was steady and cold as the steel he carried. "My lord," Ulrich said, his tone iron and quiet. "This man," he jerked his chin toward Otto, who flinched as if struck, "was bound by my hand for the murder at the river bend. He names the steward as master of the rope that took Rorik's life." Berengar made to speak, but the Baron's hand cut him down sharper than any blade. His gaze shifted to Otto, who wilted beneath it like frost-touched grain. "You confess this?" the Baron asked, his words slow and clear. Otto's head bobbed. He glanced at Ulrich's shadow beside him and found no mercy there, only the rope that would cradle his neck if his tongue faltered now. His voice stumbled out, thick with dread and stale ale. "I confess, my lord. Rorik spoke of stolen silver, coin from the tolls, slipped away through false accounts. The steward feared he talked too loud. He gave word to frighten him. He died instead." A hush deeper than before settled then. No sound but the hiss of a log collapsing in the hearth. Berengar's face was stone, though the tremor at the corner of his mouth betrayed the storm beneath the mask. The Baron stepped forward, boots silent on the rushes, cloak trailing behind like a shadow. He came to stand before Berengar, eyes narrow as a blade's edge. "You have an answer?" the Baron asked, the quiet in his voice more dangerous than a shout. Berengar's mouth worked. His fingers twitched at the hem of his cloak, grasping for some thread to bind this unraveling moment. But the hush left no room for clever words, no gap through which to slip poison unseen. At last he found his tongue. My lord, listen. These are lies spun by an axeman and a drunkard. I have served this house 20 winters." "And bled it dry," Ulrich murmured, his voice cutting clean through Berengar's plea. The Baron's eyes flicked to Ulrich, then back to Berengar. He raised a single gloved hand, and 2 men-at-arms stepped forward at once, their spears lowering as they moved to flank the steward. "You will stand trial when the sun is high," the Baron said, his tone final as earth on a coffin lid. Your ledger will speak, your coin will speak, and if they lie, the rope will speak louder. Berengar's face broke then. Rage and fear in equal measure, all the poison laid bare where once only smiles and quills had hid it. But the hush allowed him no protest. The guards hauled him back, his feet dragging in the rushes, voice lost to the echo of his own ruin. Ulrich turned his eyes to Otto, who shrank from the executioner's shadow. For you, the Baron said, his voice softer now, mercy may yet be weighed, if your tongue keeps to the truth when the trial bell tolls. Otto nodded, eyes wide as the dawn slowly peeled the dark from the high windows. Outside, the hush lifted just enough to let the day break clean upon Drauheim once more, a village where snow still drifted soft and cold, covering footprints and secrets alike. But Ulrich knew some truths could not be buried. Not by snow, nor by silence. And as the hush faded, he felt the old iron weight of his task settle back across his shoulders, a burden he would carry until his own breath left him at last, drifting like winter's hush into the dark. When the first snow of winter came drifting down upon the village, it blanketed the crooked roofs and narrow lanes in a hush that seemed to cradle even the darkest corners of its history. For Alaric, the snow was a balm of sorts, softening the edges of the world that had so long been jagged against his soul. He watched it from the small window of his chamber, the flakes catching in the faint glow of the oil lamp that burned low by his bed. His tools, worn yet polished, lay in a chest at his feet, the iron cool and silent, for once demanding nothing of him. It had been some weeks since the last execution. Rumors spoke of a reprieve from the local baron, whose mind had turned more to the threat of wolves prowling the outer fields than to the quarrels of peasants and thieves. Alaric found this lull unsettling, like an uneasy breath held too long. For as much as he loathed the tasks required of him, the silence reminded him that his craft tethered him to life's harsh certainties. Without it, he felt adrift, neither forgiven nor condemned, simply suspended in a purgatory of his own making. In those quiet nights, he dreamed of strange things. He dreamed of faces, some he recognized, others blurred by time, murmuring through the snow, their voices gentle, asking him why he remained. Sometimes his mother's voice joined them, faint but insistent, telling him he was not bound to this fate forever. And when he woke, he would find his own breath misting before him, the cold a reminder that the world was real and merciless, and that dreams, however kind, offered no escape come morning. The villagers passed him in the lanes now with uncertain eyes. They no longer feared him as they once did. Too many winters had softened their terror into a dull acceptance. But they did not greet him either. A nod, a hurried crossing to the other side of the path, a murmured word of thanks if he cleared the snow from the chapel steps. This was the closest they came to kindness. And Alaric, in turn, never asked for more. He felt he did not deserve it. Yet beneath the surface of this cold quiet, a new rumor had begun to coil its way through the timbered halls and candlelit hearths. Whispers of a band of outlaws who had taken refuge in the woods beyond the river. Men who robbed the grain wagons and tore the winter stores from the granaries, leaving farmers fearful that their children would starve before the thaw. The villagers gathered in anxious knots to speculate what would be done when these criminals were caught. Whether Alaric's axe would once again taste blood in the snow. One evening, as the frost turned the window glass to a fragile lattice of ice, a soft knock came at his door. He rose from his bed, wrapping his threadbare cloak around his shoulders, and opened it to find the parish priest standing there, lantern in hand. Father Gerwin, stooped but sharp-eyed, regarded him with an expression that held both pity and resolve. "They'll come for you soon enough," the old man said without preamble. "They'll want you ready." Alaric stepped aside to let him in, though he knew what must be said would offer no warmth against the cold. The priest sat on the single chair by the hearth, drawing his hands close to the small flame that struggled there. "They say the outlaws will be brought back by the first full moon," Father Gerwin continued, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "They've stolen food, slaughtered livestock. There's talk that one of them murdered a shepherd boy who tried to stand guard." Alaric said nothing. He lowered himself onto the rough edge of his bed and looked at his hands. They seemed strange to him now, clean, unbloodied, but marked all the same. I know what they will ask of me, he murmured. The priest nodded. And what will you ask of yourself? It was a question that made the room seem suddenly smaller, the shadows pressing in as if to hear his answer. He thought of the child who had died, innocent, undeserving of the fate that now looped its noose around the necks of desperate men. He thought of the snow, covering the graves of all who had come before, guilty or not. He thought of the promise he had once whispered to no one but the night, that he would endure his role so no other would have to bear it. I will do what I must, he said at last, his voice steady, though it cost him much to keep it so. Father Gerwin's eyes softened. He reached into the folds of his cloak and drew out a small bundle wrapped in linen. He laid it in Alaric's hands, bread still warm from the abbey ovens. You must eat, the priest said simply. You must have strength for what is to come. They sat together for a while, sharing the warmth of the modest hearth, saying little more. When the priest left, the night seemed colder than before, but Alaric felt a strange flicker inside him, whether of hope or despair he could not say. In the days that followed, the village stirred like a restless beast under its blanket of snow. Sentries were posted at the main roads. The steward's men rode out daily, their cloaks like dark birds against the white fields, seeking signs of the outlaws. Children were kept indoors, and the market fell silent, but for hurried bargains and fearful glances. And in his small chamber, Alaric polished his axe once more, though the sight of it filled him with a quiet dread. On the eve of the full moon, the snow fell again, thick and unrelenting, muffling the world in a hush so deep it might have been the breath of God himself. Alaric stood at his window and watched as lanterns bobbed in the darkness, the steward's men returning with their captives in tow. Even at a distance, he could hear the muffled weeping of wives who would soon be widows, the sharp cries of children too young to understand what had been stolen from them. His heart clenched at the sound, but he did not turn away. For there, under the cold gaze of the winter stars, Alaric knew his place in the turning of this cruel wheel. He did not forgive himself for it. He did not seek forgiveness from others. He merely waited, as he had always done, for dawn to come, and with it the bitter work that would remind him who he truly was, and perhaps, though he barely dared hope, who he might one day cease to be. At dawn, the village square transformed from its customary quietness into a place tense with uneasy anticipation. Snow clung to the edges of the wooden stage hastily erected in the center, weathered planks that had borne the weight of many condemned souls before these new ones. Frost had crept up the beams overnight, lacing them with a fragile beauty that would soon melt beneath the warmth of gathered bodies and the weight of sorrowful eyes. Alaric stood alone behind the stage, hidden from view by the rough canvas draped as a crude partition. His hands moved methodically over the edge of the axe blade, testing its sharpness with a care almost tender. Each sweep of the whetstone was accompanied by the distant murmurs of the villagers gathering, their voices muffled by scarves and the soft fall of new snow. Somewhere beyond the canvas, he could hear the barked orders of the steward's men, the clink of shackles, the whimpers of the condemned. Every sound seemed to pierce him deeper than the cold. He paused for a moment and looked up at the pale sky, where the sun struggled to break through a veil of drifting clouds. He found no warmth there, only a thin light that cast long, accusing shadows. His breath rose before him in ghostly wisps, and he wondered if those who would soon meet his blade would find solace in the idea that they would rise the same way, fleeting, weightless, gone. When the steward came, he was as grim-faced as ever, his fine cloak heavy with frost at the hem. He did not greet Alaric with words. There was little point in pleasantries on such a day. Instead, he handed him a scrap of parchment, creased and stained with the hurried ink of official condemnation. Alaric did not need to read the names to know their fates were sealed. They will be brought up one by one, the steward said, voice flat, eyes avoiding Alaric's. Do it quickly. As if speed could soothe the wound that such an act tore open. As if haste could make death more merciful than the world had already proven itself to be. Alaric nodded once, tucked the parchment into his belt, and turned away before the steward could say more. He stood behind the stage for a moment longer, his eyes drifting to the small bundle tucked into the folds of his cloak. A crust of bread, a bit of salted meat, the priest's final gift the night before. He had not touched it yet. Some part of him wished to keep it whole, as if it were a charm to ward off the darkness that waited just beyond the curtain of canvas. A low drum beat began in the square. A single drum, beaten by a village boy no older than 13. His thin arms struck the leather skin with a hesitant rhythm, each thud echoing off the timbered walls of the houses that ringed the square. The crowd shifted like a restless tide, boots crunching in the snow, breaths steaming in the brittle morning air. The first outlaw was brought forward, a man who could not have seen more than 30 winters, though hardship had carved his face into something older, more hollowed. His hair, once dark, was matted with frozen sweat, his eyes sunken yet defiant. His hands were bound tightly behind him, raw rope biting into flesh already rubbed raw from the long march back from the woods. As they pushed him up the creaking steps, he locked eyes with Alaric. No pleading, no hatred, only a grim understanding passing between them like a secret. Alaric saw in him a flicker of the boy he himself had once been. Hungry, desperate, willing to do what he must to keep life in his chest. And he wondered, not for the first time, what tiny turn of fate had made him the wielder of the axe instead of the bearer of chains. When the outlaw knelt, the murmurs in the crowd fell away, replaced by a hush so deep that even the drum faltered. Alaric stepped forward, his boots sinking into the snow-dusted boards. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, a small mercy he offered to each soul who knelt before him. Some recoiled from his touch, others leaned into it, as if seeking absolution in the warmth of a hand that would soon take all warmth away. The outlaw whispered something, words lost in the breath of the wind, and lowered his head. Alaric raised the axe, its polished blade glinting dully in the sallow light. For a heartbeat, he let his eyes drift over the crowd. Mothers clutched their children's shoulders, fathers kept their eyes hard and flat. The old priest stood near the back, his lips moving in silent prayer, hands hidden in his sleeves. And then, in a single practiced motion, the axe fell. The weight of it reverberated up through Alaric's arms, through his bones, into the hollow where his heart had learned to quiet itself. The body slumped forward, the snow beneath it blooming red like a rose unfurling in winter's grasp. A low gasp shivered through the watching throng, equal parts horror and relief. One name struck from the parchment, one soul returned to the earth. There were more to come. The next outlaw, a woman with sunken cheeks and eyes wide with a terror she could not swallow, was dragged up next. Her hair clung to her face, wet with tears she no longer tried to hide. She stumbled as she climbed the steps, her legs giving out so that the guards had to half carry her to the place where the first man's blood still steamed faintly in the snow. Alaric felt the weight in his chest tighten. He wondered if she had children hidden away in the woods, waiting for a mother who would not return. He wondered if any mercy lingered in his hands, if any word he could whisper might ease her passing. But there was no word that could make this right, only the silence of the blade. As she knelt, her sobs were swallowed by the hush that had reclaimed the square. Alaric placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling through the rough wool of her cloak. For a moment, he thought he might falter. His knees threatened to buckle, his breath caught in his throat like a stone. But he did not falter. He could not. The axe rose again. When it fell, the hush broke into a collective exhale, as if the village itself could finally breathe again. Alaric lowered the axe slowly, his arms heavy, his spirit heavier still. He did not allow himself to look at the bodies, nor at the snow stained with the life that had moments before pulsed warm beneath skin and bone. One by one, they came, some silent, some shouting curses to the sky, some whispering prayers that fell on deaf ears. One by one, Alaric gave them what the law demanded, what the village needed, what the world seemed to hunger for. The closing of a chapter written in hunger and fear. When the last body fell, the steward stepped forward and spoke words that meant little to Alaric's ears. Words of justice, of restored order, of warning to those who might think to follow the same desperate path. The villagers listened, their eyes darting between the stage and the snow at their feet, as if they could not bear to look too long at what had been done in their name. Alaric stood behind the stage until the square emptied, until the last echo of boots and murmurs faded into the hush of the falling snow. Only then did he kneel by the edge of the platform, his axe laid across his knees, and let the tears come, silent, bitter things that froze on his cheeks almost as soon as they fell. In the quiet that remained, he found no absolution. Only the snow, soft and unjudging, covering the crimson that spread like a wound through the heart of a village that dared not remember what it demanded to stay alive. The winter sun had begun its slow descent behind the spire of the chapel by the time Alaric rose from his knees. The square was empty now, save for the ravens that had come down from the eaves, their black wings stark against the drifted snow. They hopped from plank to plank, tilting their heads at the stains that marred the pale expanse, their cries sharp in the brittle air. Alaric watched them without feeling. He had come to think of these birds as his only true witnesses, uncaring, unflinching, drawn to his craft not for its cruelty, but for the simple fact of its aftermath. They knew no difference between good flesh and wicked, between the innocent and the condemned. They came for what was left behind and left him with the silence. He gathered his tools with slow hands. The axe first, he wiped it clean with a scrap of rough linen, though the stain never seemed to fully lift, not from the iron, nor from the hands that wielded it. Then the block and wedge he used for steadiness, the iron clamps, the whetstone. All of it went back into the battered chest that bore the mark of his trade more than his name ever did. By the time he shut the heavy lid, the last of the day's warmth had fled. He straightened his back, feeling every year of his burden in the stiff ache that settled between his shoulders. His breath misted in the gathering dusk, rising past the beams of the scaffold, past the dark shapes of the village's timbered roofs, up toward a sky already streaked with the first stars. He did not linger in the square. There was nothing for him there but ghosts, new ones to join the old. He slipped behind the canvas, down the back steps, his boots sinking into the churned snow. Around him, the houses glowed softly with hearth fire. He could almost believe, if he let his mind grow soft enough, that behind each shuttered window lay simple comforts. Stew bubbling in clay pots, children's laughter echoing against the beams, a lullaby hummed to chase away the dark. But for him, there would be no such warmth tonight, or any night. He turned down the narrow lane that led to the edge of the village, where his cottage crouched like an outcast beneath the bare arms of the ancient trees. As he walked, he passed the chapel, its doors thrown wide to welcome the penitents who came now to pray for mercy, for themselves, for the dead, for the living who must keep on despite what they had watched. Father Gerwin stood at the threshold, lantern in hand, his breath a plume in the frozen air. When he saw Alaric, he raised the light a little higher, illuminating the weary lines etched deep into the executioner's face. "You did what you had to," the priest said. His voice was gentle, but there was no comfort in it. They both knew how little such words weighed against the raw, cold ledger of what had been done. Alaric gave a tired nod. He paused at the chapel's steps, but did not climb them. He had not crossed that threshold in years. Not since the first time he raised his axe for the village's peace. It seemed to him that the church had no place for a man like him, nor did he wish to stain its stones with what clung to him like a second skin. "They will sleep easier now," Father Gerwin went on, as if needing to fill the silence with something other than the rustle of the night wind. "They will eat through the winter. Fear can be turned to gratitude in time." Alaric did not answer him. He looked past the priest, into the warm flicker of candlelight inside the chapel, and thought of the children who would wake tomorrow with full bellies because the grain stores were safe again. He wondered if they would remember who paid for that warmth when they were grown, if they would remember the man who stood behind the axe, or only the fear that once made them cross the street to avoid his shadow. "I must go," he said, his voice rough from disuse and grief alike. He turned before the priest could bless him, before he could whisper any prayers Alaric knew would not reach where he most needed them to go. The path to his cottage was darker than before. The lanterns in the village did not stretch this far, and the snow seemed to swallow what little moonlight filtered through the drifting clouds. He liked it this way. The dark was honest. It hid nothing but the things a man chose to leave behind. Inside, the cottage was just as he had left it. A bed of straw layered with old blankets, a hearth grown cold, a shelf with a cracked jug of water and the stale bread Father Gerwin had given him days before. He set down his chest with a thud that stirred the dust from the rushes scattered on the floor. For a while, he stood in the middle of the room, his arms limp at his sides, listening to the silence press in around him. There were no voices tonight, no murmurs from the dead, no ghostly questions threading through his dreams. Only the low creak of the wind in the eaves and the muffled call of a raven perched somewhere above, waiting for scraps that would never come. Alaric lowered himself to the floor beside the hearth. He reached for the bundle the priest had given him, unwrapped it, broke the bread in half. He ate without hunger, chewing each mouthful as though it were penance, the dry crust crumbling between teeth that had bitten through worse. When it was gone, he fed the last crumbs to the small flame he coaxed to life with the splinters of an old beam. The fire flickered, too weak to chase the chill from the stone walls, but its dance was something to look at besides the darkness. His thoughts drifted, as they always did when the village no longer needed his hands. He wondered about the men and the women whose lives he had ended that day, where their families hid tonight, whether they hated him with a fire bright enough to keep them warm. He wondered if, when his time came, any soul would stand by his grave and say his name with something other than relief. He leaned his head back against the hearth's cold stones, eyelids fluttering with the weight of exhaustion he could never seem to sleep away. In that fragile drift between waking and dreaming, he thought he heard a voice, a soft one like his mother's, singing him down into the cradle of sleep. He knew it was only the wind slipping through the cracks in the shutters, but he let it carry him all the same. Outside, the snow fell heavier. It gathered on the thatch above him, on the graves beyond the chapel, on the stage where his axe had done its work. It covered everything in the same hush, the same pale mercy, as if to remind the village and the man who kept its darkest bargain that in the end, all things would be buried in winter's gentle white. When dawn crept in again, it did so gently, unfurling like a sigh across the small window of Alaric's cottage. The pale light found him still on the floor beside the hearth, his head resting against the stones, one hand loosely curled over the ashes of the small fire he had let burn itself to sleep. He woke slowly, as though some part of him clung stubbornly to the thin veil of dreams where no blade gleamed, where no cries echoed across snow. He pushed himself up with a groan, feeling each joint protest the cold and the hours spent hunched in uneasy rest. The cottage was colder than before, and outside the hush of fresh snowfall deepened that quiet in a way that felt both comforting and cruel. He poured the last of his water into a clay mug and drank it in slow sips, tasting the faint bitterness of the wood smoke that always seemed to cling to everything in this place. There would be no summons today. No messenger at his door with a parchment that stank of wax and guilt. The village, for now, would be at peace. Its people would wake to the labor of clearing drifts from their doorways, feeding livestock, mending fences battered by the storm. They would speak of the outlaws in hushed voices at first, then less so as the memory of the scaffold dulled like an old blade laid aside for winter. They would remember his work only when they wished to remind their children how thin the line was between mercy and necessity. Alaric stepped outside into the hush, drawing his cloak tight around him. The snow reached halfway to his knees where it had drifted overnight. Each step away from the cottage left behind a shallow trench that the wind would soon cover again. He did not know where he meant to go, only that the walls could not hold him this morning, not when the sky above seemed so wide and forgiving. He followed no path, cutting instead through the tangle of bare trees that marked the edge of the village. The branches reached for him like bony hands, brushing his shoulders and catching at his hair, yet he welcomed their touch. In the woods, he was neither executioner nor villager, just a man alone with the breath of the world. A mile or so from his door, the trees gave way to a small clearing where the snow lay undisturbed, but for the faint tracks of a fox. Here the silence was complete, so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, steady and stubborn beneath the layers of wool and regret. He knelt in the drift and let the cold seep into his bones, an honest chill that demanded nothing from him but endurance. His mind drifted to the faces he had ended, this winter and all the winters before. He saw them not as they had been in their final moments, eyes wide, necks bared, but as they might have been long before desperation drew them to the gallows. A boy running through fields with his father's laughter ringing behind him, a girl kneeling in a garden, humming to herself as she turned the earth, a thief holding his daughter close by a dying fire. Lives that had begun, as all lives do, with the same fragile hope. It struck him then, not for the first time, but with a sharper ache, that mercy was not only in the staying of a blade, but in the softness of remembering what else a person might have been. He wondered if any would do the same for him. If, when his own grave was filled and his name spoken only in cautionary whispers, someone, anyone, might think to say, he was more than the axe. A sound behind him stirred him from this reverie, a rustle of feet across the snow. He turned, half expecting the black robes of Father Gerwin, the old man, come to chide him gently for straying so far alone. But it was not the priest. It was a girl, a slip of a thing in a patched cloak far too thin for the season. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, her breath huffed out in small clouds as she approached him with a hesitation that broke his heart more than any plea for mercy ever had. She held out a small bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. Bread, perhaps, or a bit of salted pork. A gift she had no reason to give. "My mother sent this," she said, voice barely louder than the hush of snow. "For you." Alaric looked at her, and for a moment he did not know how to move or speak. He saw her mother in the tilt of her head, perhaps one of the women who had once crossed the street when he passed. He wondered if it was fear or pity that had driven her to send this child to him, but when he met the girl's eyes, he saw neither. Only a simple, earnest kindness, unspoiled by the village's whispered stories. He took the bundle in his rough hands, feeling its warmth seep into his fingers. He tried to thank her, but the word caught in his throat, lodged there behind years of silence and iron and blood. So instead, he offered her a nod, a deep, trembling nod that was as close to a blessing as he could manage. She stood there a moment longer, studying him with a solemn wisdom that made her seem older than her winters. Then, without another word, she turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving only her small footprints pressed into the snow beside his. Alaric sat there in the clearing, alone again, but changed somehow by the quiet gift left in his hands. He unwrapped it slowly. Bread, yes, and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in leaves. A meal meant to be eaten by a man worth feeding. He ate it there beneath the bare sky, each bite an anchor against the drifting sorrow inside him. When he finished, he buried the cloth in the snow as if it were a relic to be kept safe until spring's thaw. And for the first time in many winters, he felt something stir within him, fragile as the flame he'd coaxed to life on so many lonely nights. A small, stubborn spark that whispered there might yet be a piece of him untouched by the axe, unclaimed by the scaffold. A piece that could, perhaps, be carried forward on the hush of falling snow and the soft, unjudging breath of the woods. When at last he stood to go, the clearing lay behind him as still as he had found it, but inside him something had shifted. He turned toward the village, toward the chapel spire that rose like a promise against the pale sky, and stepped back through the trees, leaving behind the hush for whatever awaited him next.